today's video, we dive into the shocking stories of dumb Karens who tried climbing mountains, from executives who treated expert guides like servants while the altitude destroyed their bodies, to climbers who refused to follow safety protocols until the mountains claimed their final victory. It was June 8th, 2014. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,500 feet, where the air contained only 1/3 the oxygen of sea level, and every movement required deliberate effort. The thin atmosphere and extreme cold created a hostile environment where even basic tasks became life-threatening challenges. Dolores Fitzpatrick was 51, a neighborhood association board member from suburban Illinois who had dedicated her life to creating and enforcing community regulations. She thrived on establishing order and ensuring compliance with proper procedures. Dolores had completed charity walks and several guided nature hikes in local parks, but had never camped overnight or used any technical equipment. She viewed Everest as an opportunity to demonstrate that proper planning and rule following could overcome any obstacle, treating the expedition like a community project that needed her organizational skills. The extreme altitude above 24,000 feet creates a hostile environment where the human body begins breaking down faster than it can recover. Sleep becomes nearly impossible as the brain struggles to function with reduced oxygen levels. While simple tasks require enormous effort, medical emergencies become exponentially more dangerous as evacuation options become limited by weather and terrain. The body's natural warning systems often fail at these elevations, making it difficult to recognize serious health problems before they become life-threatening. Dolores created a written schedule for base camp activities and posted it in the common area without authorization. She established quiet hours and noise restrictions for the entire expedition and demanded that all climbers sign in and out when leaving their tents. She insisted on conducting daily inspections of other climbers' gear organization and complained that meal times were too flexible and needed fixed scheduling. She requested that expedition leaders provide written reports on daily progress and criticized other climbers for not following her posted guidelines. When they ignored her unauthorized rules, she threatened to file complaints with expedition management about their non-compliance with her established procedures. On June 10th, Dolores began showing severe altitude sickness symptoms and headache, vomiting, and confusion. The expedition doctor recommended immediate descent and prescribed medication, but she refused both treatments. She insisted her herbal remedies were sufficient and accused the medical team of trying to force unnecessary drugs on her. Her condition deteriorated rapidly as she continued to reject medical intervention. Fellow climbers observed her stumbling around the camp, unable to walk in straight lines, yet she insisted on maintaining her daily inspection routine. She attempted to organize her belongings repeatedly, forgetting what she had just done and starting over again. Her speech became increasingly slurred as she tried to give orders to other climbers who watched in growing alarm. The altitude sickness affected her judgment so severely that she began accusing the medical team of conspiracy and incompetence. She threw her prescribed medication into the snow, claiming it was poison designed to make her dependent on the medical establishment. Other climbers tried to reason with her, but she responded with increasingly paranoid accusations about plots to undermine her authority. Her coordination failed as she attempted to write additional rules and regulations, her handwriting becoming illegible scrawls. By evening, her symptoms had progressed to include difficulty walking and slurred speech, indicating possible cerebral edema. Other climbers observed her applying essential oils to her temples and consuming herbal tinctures instead of taking prescribed medication. At 11:30 p.m., she was found unconscious in her tent by her tent mate. Her breathing was labored and irregular, and she was unresponsive to verbal stimuli. The tent mate immediately alerted the expedition doctor at 11:35 p.m. Medical assessment revealed signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, altered consciousness, and ataxia. Emergency descent was initiated, but her condition deteriorated rapidly during transport. Radio contact with base medical was established, but evacuation from that altitude in darkness was impossible. Dolores died at 3:20 a.m. on June 11th during the emergency descent. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of refusal of standard medical treatment and delayed descent. Evidence recovered from her tent included unused prescription altitude medication and various herbal supplements. The investigation noted that early medical intervention could have prevented the fatal outcome. It was May 15th, 2014. The summit window on Mount Everest had opened. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, climbers prepared for summit pushes. Among them was a woman whose confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. Darcy Sutherland was 41 from Boulder, Colorado. She'd climbed all 58 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks and completed mountaineering courses. By Colorado standards, she was experienced. However, Colorado's highest peak tops, out at 14,440 feet, where air contains 60% of sea level oxygen. Everest's summit has only 33%. She'd chosen a cheaper expedition company, reasoning she didn't need hand-holding. She'd been vocal during the trek, telling others that most Everest clients were tourists with no business on a serious mountain. Most significantly, Darcy decided she would not use supplemental oxygen, considering this the only legitimate way to summit. Her guide strongly advised against it, explaining fewer than 200 people had summited without oxygen, all elite mountaineers. Darcy dismissed this. During acclimatization, Darcy's confidence seemed justified. She moved quickly, often outpacing others. Her oxygen saturation stayed in the low 70s at Camp 2. She unclipped from fixed ropes on sections she deemed easy. Her guide repeatedly told her to stay clipped in. Darcy argued she'd been climbing 15 years. On May 15th, Darcy's team moved to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. Her oxygen saturation was 68%, good, especially without supplemental oxygen. That evening, the guide emphasized everyone would use oxygen from Camp 4 onward, non-negotiable. After 30 minutes of argument, Darcy reluctantly agreed to carry oxygen, but made clear she intended to summit without it if possible. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 17th. Darcy struggled more than expected, arriving noticeably fatigued. Her oxygen saturation was 62%. The summit push began at 9 p.m. Darcy started with oxygen at 2 liters per minute. At 27,000 feet, she removed her mask. The guide told her to put it back on. Darcy ignored him. Her pace slowed noticeably. Her movements became less coordinated. At the balcony at 27,500 feet, the guide checked her equipment. She turned off the flow valve. He turned it back on and stated if she turned it off again, he would end her summit attempt immediately. At 28,000 feet as dawn broke, Darcy's coordination became impaired. She stumbled on flat ground. The guide recognized cerebral hypoxia and increased her oxygen flow. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet around 6:30 a.m. Darcy sat heavily. Her response was slow, words slurred. The guide performed a coordination test. Darcy missed his finger twice. Clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The guide told Darcy they needed to descend immediately. Darcy refused. The guide radioed base camp. They advised immediate descent. Darcy stood and walked toward the summit, not down. The guide grabbed her arm. Darcy pulled away. At 28,700 feet, he barely had strength to move himself, let alone restrain a client. He followed, hoping to convince her to turn around. Darcy continued at extremely slow pace. Other climbers passed. Several asked if everything was okay. The guide said his client showed cerebral edema signs but refused to descend. At 7:30 a.m., Darcy reached the traverse below the Hillary Step. Her movements were uncoordinated. Halfway across, she stopped, swaying. The guide grabbed her harness. Her eyes were unfocused. She didn't seem to recognize him. The guide turned her around and clipped her, facing downward. Darcy didn't respond but moved when pushed. After approximately 100 feet, her legs buckled. She couldn't support her weight. Her consciousness was declining rapidly. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. He tried dragging her, but moving an incapacitated person at that altitude was nearly impossible. Over 30 minutes, Darcy deteriorated. She became unresponsive. Her breathing became irregular. At 8:15 a.m., she lost consciousness. The guide checked for a pulse, weak and rapid. He tried dragging her toward the south summit, but managed only 50 feet over 20 minutes, exhausting himself to the point of risking his own life. At 8:45 a.m., Darcy stopped breathing. Rescue breathing at 28,600 feet was ineffective. He checked for a pulse. None. Darcy Sutherland was dead. The guide radioed that his client had died. He was instructed to descend immediately. He moved her body slightly off the main route and descended. Days later, a team attempted to move her body but found it frozen in place. Official cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of inadequate supplemental oxygen use, continued ascent despite symptoms, and refusal to descend when advised. The guide's radio logs documented his repeated warnings and Darcy's refusals. Darcy Sutherland's body remains on Everest at approximately 28,550 feet, visible to climbers who pass that section. It was May 8th, 2018. The death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest had already seen unusual traffic that climbing season, with inexperienced climbers creating dangerous bottlenecks on the narrow ridge routes, where every minute of delay increased the risk of fatal exposure. The mountain's most treacherous section had become a highway of ambition, where climbers with vastly different skill levels competed for the same narrow weather windows that meant the difference between summit success and death. The 2018 climbing season had been marked by particularly dangerous conditions, with multiple fatalities already recorded due to overcrowding and inexperienced climbers attempting the summit without adequate preparation. Weather patterns had been unpredictable, creating shorter summit windows that compressed the climbing schedule and increased pressure on expedition teams to push clients beyond safe limits. The combination of commercial pressure and social media-driven adventure tourism had created a perfect storm of dangerous conditions on the world's highest mountain. Local climbing authorities had issued warnings about the increased risks, but the lucrative nature of Everest expeditions meant that many companies continued accepting clients regardless of their qualifications or the deteriorating safety conditions on the mountain. Bryn Castellano was 26, a social media influencer from Phoenix who had gained a substantial following posting fitness and lifestyle content. Her online presence featured daily workout videos, motivational quotes, and sponsored content for athletic wear brands that had made her a modest income in the competitive influencer marketplace. 3 weeks earlier, she had posted about watching a viral YouTube video of an Everest summit, announcing to her followers that this would be her next big adventure and the ultimate test of her fitness journey. The post had generated significant engagement from her audience, with thousands of comments expressing both excitement and concern about her ambitious plans. Her mountaineering experience consisted entirely of occasional desert hiking in Arizona, typically day trips to popular trails with established paths and minimal elevation gain. She had told friends and documented in her social media posts that her daily gym routine of cardio and strength training would be sufficient preparation for climbing the world's highest mountain. Her fitness content had focused on indoor workouts and lifestyle motivation rather than outdoor adventure or technical skills development. The highest elevation she had ever reached was approximately 7,000 feet during a hiking trip to Flagstaff, a far cry from the 29,032-foot summit of Everest that would require months of specialized high-altitude training and acclimatization. Her decision to attempt Everest had been impulsive, driven by the viral video's portrayal of summit success as the ultimate achievement for fitness enthusiasts. The video had shown dramatic footage of climbers reaching the summit with triumphant music and inspirational messaging, but had omitted the years of training, technical skill development, and mountaineering experience required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had interpreted the content as validation that physical fitness alone was sufficient preparation for the world's most challenging mountain. She had shared the video with her followers, adding her own commentary about how the achievement represented the perfect combination of mental toughness and physical conditioning that she had been developing through her fitness journey. The influencer culture surrounding extreme adventures had created a dangerous misconception that social media documentation was as important as proper preparation and safety protocols. Bryn had been influenced by other content creators who had attempted high-profile adventures with minimal experience, focusing on the dramatic visual content rather than the extensive behind-the-scenes preparation that successful expeditions required. Her content strategy had become increasingly focused on pushing boundaries and attempting more extreme challenges to maintain audience engagement and attract new followers in the competitive fitness influencer marketplace. Her preparation for the expedition had been entirely inadequate for the technical and physical demands of high-altitude mountaineering. She had spent only 2 weeks at a local climbing gym, learning basic rope techniques, and had completed a single weekend mountaineering course that covered elementary skills like crampon use and ice axe handling. Her physical training had consisted of increased cardio workouts and stair climbing exercises, but she had never experienced the effects of high altitude or practiced with the technical equipment required for Everest climbing. Bryn had maxed out multiple credit cards to pay for a budget expedition service, posting about her plans to reach the top of the world and document the journey for her followers. The financial strain of funding the expedition had required her to take on additional sponsored content and promotional partnerships in the weeks leading up to her departure. She had purchased climbing gear online based on equipment lists provided by the expedition company, arriving in Nepal with technical equipment she had never used in real climbing conditions. Her gear selection had been influenced more by aesthetic considerations for her social media content than by practical functionality and safety requirements for extreme altitude mountaineering. Her expedition leader had documented concerns about her lack of experience in his client assessment notes, noting her unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering equipment and techniques during the initial gear check. However, she had signed all required liability waivers and paid the full expedition fee, meeting the legal requirements for participation despite the guide's reservations about her preparedness for the technical and physical demands of the climb. The expedition company's business model relied on volume rather than client qualification, accepting anyone willing to pay the fees and sign the extensive liability documentation that protected the company from legal consequences of client injuries or deaths. Above 26,000 feet, climbers enter the death zone, where the human body begins dying from oxygen deprivation, requiring supplemental oxygen to maintain basic cognitive function and prevent fatal altitude sickness. May temperatures on Everest ranged from minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the day to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, with wind chill factors that could drop effective temperatures to life-threatening levels within minutes. The summit route required navigating knife-edge ridges with steep drops of thousands of feet, technical rock steps that demanded advanced climbing skills, and areas where fixed ropes provided the only protection against fatal falls. Weather windows for summit attempts typically lasted only a few hours before afternoon storms brought whiteout conditions, hurricane force winds, and rapidly dropping temperatures that could kill exposed climbers within minutes. The thin air at extreme altitude meant that even experienced mountaineers operated with severely reduced physical and mental capacity, making technical decision-making and equipment use exponentially more difficult than at sea level. Simple tasks that required seconds at sea level could take minutes or become impossible entirely in the death zone, where cognitive function deteriorated rapidly and physical coordination became severely impaired. The death zone earned its name because the human body cannot survive extended exposure to the altitude and conditions, with every hour spent above 26,000 feet increasing the risk of fatal complications, including cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, and complete cardiovascular collapse. The combination of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and technical climbing challenges demanded months of acclimatization training and extensive mountaineering experience for safe passage through the zone. Even experienced climbers typically spent no more than 12 to 16 hours in the death zone during summit attempts, as longer exposure guaranteed fatal physiological breakdown, regardless of fitness level or preparation. The commercialization of Everest had created a dangerous environment where expedition companies competed for clients by lowering experience requirements and safety standards. Budget operators often accepted climbers with minimal qualifications to fill expedition slots, relying on liability waivers and the assumption that guides could compensate for client inexperience. This practice had led to increasingly crowded conditions on summit day, where traffic jams in the death zone exposed all climbers to extended periods of fatal altitude exposure while waiting for inexperienced climbers to navigate technical sections. The economic incentives of the climbing industry had created a system where profit margins often took precedence over safety considerations, particularly for budget expedition companies competing against more expensive operators who maintained stricter client qualification standards. The psychological effects of extreme altitude also created dangerous overconfidence in inexperienced climbers, who often interpreted their survival of lower elevations as evidence of their readiness for the summit push. Altitude sickness could impair judgment while simultaneously creating euphoric feelings that masked the severity of physical deterioration, leading climbers to make increasingly poor decisions as they ascended higher into more dangerous terrain. The The combination of oxygen deprivation and extreme physical stress often produced a false sense of invincibility that caused inexperienced climbers to dismiss safety protocols and ignore warning signs that would normally trigger immediate retreat to lower elevations. Multiple expedition companies had refused Bryn as a client due to her complete lack of mountaineering experience, a fact documented in email exchanges her family later recovered from her laptop. The rejection emails specifically cited her absence of high-altitude climbing experience, lack of technical mountaineering skills, and insufficient time for proper training as disqualifying factors for Everest participation. Several outfitters had recommended she gain experience on smaller peaks and complete mountaineering courses before attempting Everest, advice she had dismissed in favor of finding a company willing to accept her payment. The more reputable expedition companies required evidence of successful climbs on peaks above 20,000 feet, technical climbing certifications, and demonstrated competence with mountaineering equipment before accepting clients for Everest expeditions. The budget expedition company that eventually accepted Bryn had a questionable safety record and a business model based on accepting clients that other operators had rejected. Their marketing materials emphasized the adventure and achievement aspects of Everest climbing, while minimizing the technical requirements and safety considerations that made the mountain so dangerous for inexperienced climbers. The company's guides were often overloaded with too many clients to provide adequate supervision, particularly for inexperienced climbers who required constant monitoring and assistance with basic mountaineering tasks. During the acclimatization period at base camp, Bryn's inexperience became increasingly apparent to other expedition members and support staff. She struggled with basic tasks like adjusting her oxygen mask, properly securing her crampon bindings, and managing her gear in cold weather conditions. Other climbers on the expedition later reported that she had difficulty sleeping at altitude and showed signs of altitude sickness, even at the relatively low elevation of base camp. Her social media posts from this period showed her excitement about the adventure, but also revealed her lack of understanding about the serious nature of the challenges ahead. During the approach to high camp at 26,000 feet, her guide had noted in his daily expedition log that she struggled with basic equipment use, including crampon attachment, oxygen mask operation, and rope handling techniques that were essential for safe movement in the death zone. Her tent partner, another climber on the expedition, later reported that Bryn had spent the pre-summit rest period taking photos and posting to social media instead of sleeping and conserving energy for the demanding summit push. The rest period before summit attempts was critical for physical and mental preparation, as climbers needed to conserve every possible resource for the extreme demands of the death zone ascent. The night before the summit attempt, she had posted content showing her excitement about reaching the top, despite visible signs of altitude sickness, including headaches, nausea, and disorientation, that experienced climbers recognized as warning signs of dangerous altitude exposure. Her guide had noted her symptoms and recommended she consider descending rather than continuing to higher altitude, advice she had documented herself dismissing in her social media posts. The social media documentation had become more important to her than the safety recommendations, as she had promised her followers that she would reach the summit and document the achievement for their entertainment and inspiration. She had ignored multiple turnback recommendations from her guide at various checkpoints during the ascent, including the balcony at 27,600 feet, where many climbers abort their summit attempts due to time constraints or physical condition. Her phone recorded her dismissing physical symptoms, including severe headaches, difficulty breathing, and coordination problems that indicated dangerous altitude sickness progression. Each checkpoint represented a critical decision point where climbers needed to honestly assess their condition and abort the summit attempt if they were showing signs of serious altitude-related illness. During the final approach through the death zone, Bryn had fallen significantly behind the group pace, requiring frequent rest stops that consumed precious time during the narrow weather window. Her guide had repeatedly urged her to maintain the established climbing schedule, explaining that delays in the death zone exponentially increased the risk of fatal exposure when afternoon storms arrived. She had documented her struggles on camera, showing herself gasping for breath and stumbling on technical sections that experienced climbers navigated efficiently. The footage revealed her complete unfamiliarity with high-altitude climbing techniques and her dangerous tendency to prioritize social media documentation over safety and efficiency. Other expedition teams passing her group had noted her obvious distress and questioned whether she should continue the ascent. Several experienced climbers had stopped to offer assistance and additional oxygen, concerned about her visible symptoms of severe altitude sickness and her apparent unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering techniques. Her guide had been managing multiple clients simultaneously and was unable to provide the constant supervision that her inexperience required in the technical terrain of the upper mountain. The guide-to-client ratio on budget expeditions often made it impossible to provide adequate supervision for inexperienced climbers who needed constant assistance and monitoring. Her social media documentation during the ascent showed increasingly erratic behavior and poor decision-making as altitude sickness progressed. Posts from higher elevations contained rambling captions and showed her removing essential safety equipment for better photo opportunities, behavior that experienced mountaineers recognized as clear signs of impaired judgment due to oxygen deprivation. The content she was creating for her followers was actively endangering her life, but the altitude had impaired her ability to recognize the growing danger. Her followers had been commenting with increasing concern about her appearance and behavior in the posts, but she had been unable to process their warnings due to her deteriorating mental state. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying these stories, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content like this. The pressure to create compelling content had become a dangerous distraction from the life or death decisions required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had been stopping frequently to film herself and document her experience, consuming valuable time and energy that should have been devoted to efficient movement and safety protocols. The social media documentation had become an obsession that overrode her survival instincts and prevented her from recognizing the severity of her deteriorating condition. Weather reports available to all expedition teams showed a narrow summit window with dangerous storm conditions expected by early afternoon, requiring climbers to reach the summit and begin descent by noon to avoid potentially fatal exposure. The forecast indicated rapidly deteriorating conditions with high winds and whiteout snow that would make navigation impossible and increase the risk of fatal exposure for anyone caught above the death zone during the storm. The weather window was particularly narrow that day, with meteorologists predicting that conditions would become unsurvivable for anyone exposed above 26,000 feet after 2 p.m. At approximately 27,800 feet, just 200 feet below the summit, Bryn became separated from her group while stopping to document her climb on camera for her social media followers. She had missed the established turnaround time by over an hour and continued climbing alone as weather conditions began deteriorating according to the predicted forecast. Her phone camera captured her stumbling repeatedly as she moved upward without her guide, showing clear signs of severe altitude sickness and complete physical exhaustion. The separation from her group had occurred gradually as she fell further behind, with her guide eventually losing visual contact during the deteriorating weather conditions. The incoming storm conditions reduced visibility to near zero within minutes as predicted, creating whiteout conditions where climbers could become lost within feet of established routes. During her struggle to continue upward, her oxygen regulator began malfunctioning, delivering inconsistent flow rates that she was unable to diagnose or repair due to her inexperience with the technical equipment. The combination of equipment malfunction and depleted oxygen reserves created a critical emergency that required immediate technical knowledge she did not possess. Her oxygen supply, which should have lasted until her planned descent, began running low due to the extended time she had spent in the death zone and the increased consumption caused by her inefficient climbing pace. Something was wrong with her breathing apparatus, but she was unable to take corrective action in her deteriorated state. The malfunction was a problem that experienced climbers knew how to prevent and fix, but Bryn had never encountered this issue during her limited training. As her oxygen supply became increasingly inadequate, Bryn's physical condition deteriorated rapidly in the extreme altitude and cold conditions. Her camera footage showed her becoming increasingly disoriented and unsteady, with her speech becoming slurred and incoherent as oxygen deprivation affected her brain function. The combination of severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and complete physical exhaustion created a cascade of life-threatening conditions that she was unable to manage. Her movements became increasingly erratic as hypoxia affected her motor control and decision-making ability. Unable to repair her oxygen equipment or locate her group in the whiteout conditions, Bryn collapsed approximately within 150 feet below the summit. She lay motionless in the snow, too exhausted to continue and unable to descend without assistance. The malfunctioning oxygen equipment provided insufficient flow to sustain life at that altitude, while the storm conditions made rescue impossible. The location where she collapsed was exposed to the full force of the incoming storm, with no natural shelter or protection from the elements. She attempted to call for help, but the extreme altitude and equipment failure had left her too weak to move or signal effectively. The combination of oxygen deprivation, hypothermia, and complete physical collapse proved fatal within hours. Her body was found in the same location where she had collapsed, with her malfunctioning oxygen equipment still attached. The investigation determined that inexperience with critical life support equipment had contributed to her death in the death zone. Bryn's guide discovered she was missing when his group reached the summit and began their mandatory descent to avoid the incoming storm. The guide had been managing multiple clients during the summit push and had lost visual contact with Bryn during the final approach, assuming she had turned back as recommended due to her obvious altitude sickness, symptoms, and missed turnaround time. The guide's primary responsibility had been to get his other clients safely to the summit and back down, making it impossible to provide the constant supervision that Bryn's inexperience had required. The search for Bryn was immediately hampered by the severe weather conditions that had been predicted for the afternoon, with the storm arriving exactly as forecasted and bringing hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made any search efforts impossible and extremely dangerous for potential rescuers. Severe weather conditions prevented immediate search efforts in the area where she had collapsed, as the predicted storm had arrived with hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made helicopter operations impossible and put ground search teams at extreme risk. The storm system lasted for 3 days, during which time any chance of survival for someone exposed on the mountain face was eliminated by the combination of extreme cold and wind exposure. Rescue teams were unable to access the area until weather cleared sufficiently for helicopter reconnaissance flights, and her body was located by aerial search at the location where she had collapsed, though recovery operations were deemed too dangerous due to ongoing avalanche conditions and the extreme altitude that limited helicopter performance. The medical examiner determined that Bryn died from a combination of severe altitude sickness, hypothermia, and oxygen deprivation caused by equipment failure and complete physical exhaustion. The investigation found evidence of her separation from the group and equipment malfunction that had contributed to her collapse. The investigation found that her climbing gear met safety standards, but noted that her inexperience with oxygen equipment, maintenance, and troubleshooting had been a critical factor in the fatal outcome. The case was classified as an accidental death with contributing factors of inexperience, severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and adverse weather conditions. Her family pursued legal action against the expedition company for accepting an unqualified climber, though the signed liability waivers complicated their case. Her social media accounts were memorialized by her family, who removed her final posts from the mountain and replaced them with warnings about the dangers of attempting extreme adventures without proper preparation. The expedition company faced minimal regulatory consequences and continued marketing to inexperienced climbers, promoting Everest as an achievable goal for clients with basic fitness and financial resources. It was May 12, 2016. Base camp at 17,598 feet sprawled across the rocky moraine like a temporary city of colorful tents and prayer flags, while climbers made final preparations in the thin air before dawn. The weather window for summit attempts was closing rapidly, creating an atmosphere of urgency and tension throughout the camp. Magnolia Pristine Ashworth was 42, a pharmaceutical heiress from Connecticut who was accustomed to having staff anticipate her every need. Money had always solved her problems, and she expected the same level of service she received at luxury resorts. She had completed 3 guided climbs in Colorado's 14ers and spent a week at a mountaineering school in France. Though she had never been above 14,500 feet, or used technical climbing equipment extensively. The expedition cost her $85,000, which she considered a guarantee of premium treatment and priority access throughout the climb. The Khumbu Icefall contains some of the world's most dangerous terrain, with massive ice blocks constantly shifting and creating hidden crevasses up to 100 feet deep. Snow bridges over these crevasses can appear solid, but collapse without warning under a climber's weight. The icefall moves up to 3 feet per day, making safe routes obsolete within hours and requiring constant vigilance from climbers navigating the unstable terrain. Fixed ropes and ladder systems provide the only safe passage through this deadly maze of ice and snow. Magnolia demanded her tent be moved to a more level spot, claiming the current location was unacceptable for someone of her status. She insisted on being served meals first, arguing that her dietary restrictions required priority attention over other climbers. When other team members made noise during gear preparation, she complained loudly and demanded they be quieter during her rest periods. She refused to carry her share of group equipment, stating she had paid extra to avoid such responsibilities. When told she couldn't skip acclimatization rotations, she asked to speak with expedition management immediately. She criticized the quality of base camp facilities and demanded upgrades to her accommodation, threatening to leave negative reviews if her concerns weren't addressed. The expedition leader briefed all climbers about rope discipline and wading protocols, but Magnolia repeatedly interrupted to ask about special arrangements for premium clients. At 6:45 a.m., approximately 1,000 feet above base camp in the Khumbu Icefall, Magnolia became impatient with the pace of climbers ahead. She unclipped from the fixed rope system and attempted to pass the line of climbers on the unstable snow to the left. The area was marked with warning flags indicating crevasse danger. As she stepped onto what appeared to be solid snow, the thin snow bridge collapsed under her weight. The sound of cracking snow echoed through the icefall as the bridge gave way beneath her feet. Other climbers shouted warnings, but the collapse happened too quickly for anyone to react. Her expensive gear scattered as she fell, with her custom-made ice axe clattering against the crevasse walls during her descent. The climber who witnessed the fall later described hearing her voice echoing from deep within the ice before it gradually faded to silence. The narrow crevasse walls pressed against her body as she became wedged in the confined space. Her breathing became increasingly labored as the tight confines restricted her chest movement. The weight of her heavy pack, loaded with luxury items she had insisted on bringing, pushed her deeper into the narrowing gap. Ice crystals formed on her breath in the frigid air as she struggled against the unforgiving walls that held her trapped. She fell approximately 80 feet into a crevasse that was 4 feet wide at the top and narrowed to 18 inches at the bottom. Her headlamp illuminated blue ice walls as she became wedged between them. The climber directly behind her witnessed the fall and immediately radioed for help. Magnolia was conscious initially, but trapped in a position that restricted breathing. The narrow confines and her heavy pack made extraction impossible with available equipment. The witness radioed at base camp at 6:47 a.m. using expedition communication equipment. A rescue team was assembled, but required specialized crevasse rescue gear to be transported up from base camp. The technical rescue took 4 hours to organize due to the location's difficulty and the need for additional anchoring equipment. By the time rescuers reached the crevasse, there was no response to their calls. Magnolia's body was recovered 6 hours after the fall. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as asphyxiation due to positional compression in a confined space. Contributing factors included failure to follow established safety protocols and attempting to bypass designated climbing routes. The incident was briefly mentioned in climbing publications as a reminder about rope discipline.
It was May 18, 2016, and the air at Camp 4 held the thin, metallic quality that existed only above 26,000 feet. The South Col stretched flat and windswept at the threshold of Everest's death zone, a desolate expanse of rock, ice, and shredded tent fabric left by previous expeditions. Temperatures sat well below zero as afternoon shadows lengthened across the col. The wind carried a constant low howl, buffeting the bright tents clustered near the camp's established zones. sounds. Prayer flags snapped violently overhead, their colors faded by ultraviolet radiation and abrasive ice crystals. Climbers moved slowly between tents, their bodies laboring in air, where the usable oxygen pressure was roughly a third of sea level. Simple tasks, melting snow for water, adjusting equipment, pulling on boots, required rest breaks and conscious effort. Conversations were brief, words spoken in short bursts between breaths. The mountain pressed down on everyone equally at this altitude, stripping away pretense and revealing who had prepared adequately and who had not. Among the climbers staged at Camp 4 was Jennifer Pearson, a 39-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona. Jennifer had built a career as a corporate consultant, specializing in leadership development and mental performance coaching. Her client list included Fortune 500 companies, and her keynote speaking fees had reached 5 figures per appearance. She had founded her consulting firm 11 years earlier, after spending a decade in corporate management, building it from a single-person operation into a company with 12 employees and annual revenue exceeding $2 million. Her professional success had been built on a personal brand, centered around mental toughness and the capacity to push through discomfort. Her presentations featured stories of completing ultramarathons, adventure races, and high-altitude climbs as metaphors for business challenges. She had summited Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, Aconcagua, and Denali over a 4-year period. Each climb documented extensively on social media and incorporated into her speaking content. Her audience responded to her message that extraordinary achievement was available to anyone willing to train their mind to override their body's limitations. Jennifer was genuinely fit. She maintained a training regimen that included running 50 miles per week, strength training 4 days weekly, and altitude simulation sessions in a hypoxic chamber near her home. Her VO2 max tested in the superior range for her age group. She had completed 2 Ironman triathlons and finished in the top 20% of her division in both. Her physical capabilities were legitimate, built through thousands of hours of disciplined training that would have broken most people before they reached her level. What she lacked was humility about the limits of that preparation. Jennifer had internalized her successes as evidence that expertise was transferable across domains. That mental toughness developed through business and endurance sports qualified her to make mountaineering decisions that contradicted experienced guides. She had come to believe that Sherpas and guides existed to provide logistical support and manage equipment, not to override her judgment about her own capabilities. Her Everest expedition had been guided by Tsewang Rinji, 43 years old, from Tame Village in the Khumbu Valley. Tsewang had summited Everest 12 times across a 17-year guiding career. He had worked as a rope-fixing team member for 5 seasons, a high-altitude rescue coordinator for 3, and had personally participated in 4 body recoveries from above 26,000 feet. His face showed the cumulative damage of sustained extreme altitude exposure. Deep lines carved by wind and cold, eyes slightly sunken from dehydration that had become chronic, skin weathered to a texture that made him appear older than his years. Tsewang supported an extended family that included his wife, 3 children, his elderly mother, and his younger brother's family after his brother had died in a climbing accident on Cho Oyu 8 years earlier. His guiding income funded his children's education in Kathmandu, covered medical expenses for his mother's diabetes treatment, and supported his brother's widow and her 2 children. The financial pressure was constant and unavoidable. Walking away from a client, even a difficult one, meant not only losing the expedition fee but risking his reputation within the tight network of expedition companies that controlled access to guiding work. The problems with Jennifer had started during the approach trek to base camp. She questioned Tsewang's pacing decisions, suggesting he was moving the team too slowly and wasting valuable acclimatization time. When he explained that gradual ascent reduced altitude sickness risk, she responded that she had researched acclimatization protocols extensively and felt confident in her own assessment of appropriate pacing. At base camp, she interrupted his safety briefings to offer her own observations about equipment and technique, framing them as helpful additions rather than challenges to his authority. During the first rotation to Camp 1, Jennifer criticized the fixed ropes in the Khumbu icefall, stating they appeared poorly maintained and suggesting that expedition companies were cutting corners on safety. Tsewang explained that rope-fixing teams, including himself in previous seasons, installed and maintained thousands of feet of line under brutal conditions, that the ropes were inspected daily, and that what appeared as wear was normal for equipment subjected to extreme cold, UV radiation, and constant use. Jennifer responded that she was simply advocating for higher standards, that clients deserved the best possible safety measures given the fees they paid. The pattern repeated throughout the expedition. Jennifer treated Sewang's guidance as suggestions subject to her approval, rather than instructions from someone with vastly more experience in the specific environment where they were operating. She was never overtly rude, never raised her voice, but her behavior communicated a fundamental disrespect packaged in the language of quality control and personal empowerment. She referred to him as her guide in conversations with other climbers, using possessive language that reduced him to a service provider, rather than acknowledging him as a mountaineering expert whose judgment could mean the difference between life and death. Other Sherpas on the expedition noticed and discussed Jennifer's behavior during private moments. The consensus was that she represented a familiar type, the successful Western client who had achieved enough in their own domain to believe their competence was universal. These clients were among the most dangerous to guide because their confidence was genuine and their self-assessment was partially accurate. Jennifer was fit, mentally tough, and capable of enduring significant discomfort. Those qualities made her dismissal of Sewang's warnings more credible to herself and harder to override with safety concerns she interpreted as overcautious. The critical conversation occurred on the evening of May 18th at Camp 4. Sewang gathered his clients for the final pre-summit briefing in the mess tent, a cramped space where 6 people sat shoulder to shoulder while the wind hammered the fabric walls. He reviewed the summit timeline: departure at 11 p.m., estimated summit arrival between 6 and 8 a.m. depending on conditions, and a mandatory turnaround time of late morning, noon at the latest, regardless of position. He emphasized the turnaround time repeatedly. Climbers who ignored it died with predictable regularity, exhausting themselves reaching the summit and then discovering they lacked the reserves to descend before darkness and hypothermia killed them. Then he addressed oxygen protocols. Each climber would climb on supplemental oxygen, with enough cylinders assigned for the push and the descent. Most would swap bottles at the balcony and again near the south summit, depending on pace and flow rate. Regulators would start around 2 liters per minute and would be increased if anyone showed signs of distress. Running out of oxygen that high didn't just slow you down, it could tip someone from functional to confused in minutes. Jennifer raised her hand and stated she wanted to discuss a modification to the oxygen plan. She explained that she had been researching no oxygen ascents, climbs where mountaineers reached the summit, breathing only ambient air without supplemental oxygen. Elite climbers like Reinhold Messner had proven it was possible. She had trained extensively in her hypoxic chamber, and the work had reinforced her belief that she could tolerate limited oxygen better than most climbers. She wanted to attempt the upper mountain without supplemental oxygen, using it only if she experienced severe distress. The tent fell silent except for the wind. The other climbers looked at Jennifer, then at Sewang, waiting for his response. Sewang took a slow breath, organizing his thoughts before speaking. He explained that no oxygen ascents required years of specialized preparation that went far beyond fitness and altitude chamber training. Climbers who summited without oxygen typically spent extended time at extreme altitude acclimatizing their bodies to function in conditions where most people would die within hours. They climbed with minimal equipment to reduce weight, moved faster than guided clients, and possessed decades of high-altitude experience that allowed them to recognize when their bodies were failing before cognitive impairment destroyed their judgment. Jennifer had none of those advantages. Her acclimatization schedule had been designed around supplemental oxygen use. Her body had not adapted to function without it above 26,000 feet. Attempting to summit without oxygen after preparing with it was not a test of mental toughness. It was physiological self-sabotage. Her brain would be the first thing to suffer. Her coordination would fail. Her judgment would deteriorate until she could no longer recognize she was in danger. She could collapse somewhere on the upper mountain, and at that altitude, rescue was often impossible. Jennifer's response revealed that she had already decided. She appreciated Sewang's concern, but she felt confident in her preparation and believed her training qualified her to make this attempt. She had signed liability waivers acknowledging she was climbing at her own risk. She understood the dangers and accepted them. She said it wasn't impulsive, that she'd been thinking about it for months and wanted to take the mask off for the upper mountain. She wanted the accomplishment of summiting Everest the way the pioneers had done it, proving that the mountain could still be climbed through human capability rather than technological support. Sewang tried a different approach. He asked whether Jennifer understood that her decision would affect more than just herself. If she collapsed above 27,000 feet, he would be obligated to attempt a rescue, which would put his own life at risk. Other Sherpas might be pulled from their clients to assist. The entire expedition's summit attempt could be compromised. Her choice to climb without oxygen created cascading consequences for everyone connected to her on the mountain. Jennifer responded that she would not expect rescue. If she got into trouble, she would take full responsibility for her decision. If she felt unable to continue, she would turn around and descend on her own. She was not asking anyone else to take risks on her behalf. She was simply exercising her right to climb her own climb. The statement demonstrated how completely she misunderstood the situation. Above 26,000 feet, climbers rarely recognized when they were in trouble until they had already lost the capacity to save themselves. Hypoxia destroyed judgment before it destroyed the body. Promising to turn around if she felt unable to continue was meaningless. By the time she felt that way, she would lack the cognitive function to execute the descent. And in the death zone, even a client insisting they don't want rescue does not prevent others from being drawn in once they are incapacitated on a fixed-line route. Sewang made his final argument. He had guided Everest for 17 years and had seen dozens of clients collapse from hypoxia, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The pattern was always the same: strong climbers who believed their fitness made them immune to altitude effects, who pushed beyond safe limits, who made small mistakes that compounded into fatal outcomes. Jennifer's plan fit that pattern exactly. In his experience, clients who did this often didn't come back down. He stated this as fact, not speculation, that once someone committed to that choice high on the mountain, he might not be able to reverse it. Jennifer's expression hardened. She suggested that Sewang was being unnecessarily negative, that his experience had made him risk-averse in ways that prevented clients from achieving their potential. She had not spent tens of thousands of dollars and trained for 2 years to have her ambitions limited by someone else's fears. She would be using minimal oxygen on the summit attempt. The conversation was over. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. After the briefing ended and clients dispersed to their tents, Sewang sat alone in the mess tent, wrestling with the decision he faced. He could refuse to guide Jennifer, which would likely end his career. The expedition company would side with the paying client, and word would spread through the guiding community that he abandoned clients over disagreements about climbing style. Or he could continue guiding her, knowing that her decision was likely to end badly, and that he might witness another preventable death because commercial imperatives overrode safety considerations. He thought about his children in Kathmandu, their school fees due in 2 months. He thought about his mother's medical expenses, the surgery she needed that insurance did not cover. He thought about his brother's widow and her children, dependent on his income since his brother died. Walking away would devastate his family financially. Staying meant watching Jennifer push into a margin he couldn't control. At 10:30 p.m., climbers began final preparations. They dressed in layers, base layers, insulation, down suits, and shell jackets. They checked headlamps, adjusted crampons, and verified that oxygen regulators functioned properly. The atmosphere was tense with the anticipation that preceded every summit push, a mixture of excitement, fear, and the knowledge that some percentage of people departing Camp 4 would not return alive. Jennifer emerged from her tent carrying 2 oxygen bottles instead of 3. When Sewang asked about the missing bottle, she stated she would be using supplemental oxygen only to the balcony, then switching to ambient air for the remainder of the climb. Sewang attached the 3rd bottle to her pack anyway and told her it would be available if she needed it. Jennifer said nothing, but her expression made clear she had no intention of using it. The climb began at 11 p.m. Under a sky so clear the stars provided enough light to see the route even before the moon rose. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal wind. Exceptional conditions that opened a legitimate summit window. Teams departed in staggered intervals, their headlamps creating a chain of lights ascending toward the southeast ridge. The route from Camp 4 climbed a rocky slope toward the balcony, gaining roughly 1,600 vertical feet over terrain that was steep but not technically difficult. Progress was slow. Each step required multiple breaths. Each breath delivered inadequate oxygen to muscles screaming for more. Jennifer moved steadily, her fitness allowing her to maintain pace with other climbers despite the altitude. Sewang stayed close behind, watching for signs of distress. At the balcony, reached around 3:30 a.m., Jennifer removed her oxygen mask while other climbers changed bottles. Sewang moved beside her and stated clearly that continuing without oxygen from this point was suicide. Her body had been supported by supplemental oxygen for the past 4 hours. Removing it suddenly at 27,600 feet would trigger immediate physiological stress. She needed to keep the oxygen flowing. Jennifer responded that she felt strong and clear-headed. Her breathing was controlled. She had no symptoms of altitude sickness. She was continuing without supplemental oxygen. Before Sewang could respond further, she clipped into the fixed line and began climbing toward the south summit. The deterioration began within 40 minutes. Jennifer's pace slowed noticeably as her body struggled to function on ambient air that contained less oxygen than her brain and muscles required to sustain effort. Her rest stops became more frequent, every 20 steps, then every 15, then every 10. Her breathing grew rapid and shallow, her body trying to compensate for hypoxia by increasing respiration rate. But at 28,000 feet, breathing faster simply meant processing more of the same inadequate air. Sewang climbed directly behind her, close enough to grab her harness if she stumbled. He repeated his warnings each time she stopped to rest. Her oxygen mask was attached to her pack. She could restore oxygen flow in seconds. She needed to make that choice now, before hypoxia destroyed her ability to reason. Jennifer waved him off without speaking, saving her breath for climbing. By the south summit at 28,700 feet, reached around 6:15 a.m. as dawn broke across the Himalayas, Jennifer's coordination had deteriorated visibly. She fumbled with her safety carabiner at the anchor point, taking nearly a minute to complete a task that should have required seconds. Her movements were clumsy, her fingers unresponsive. When Sewang asked if she knew where she was, she gestured vaguely toward the true summit and said something incoherent about finish lines. The final section from the south summit to the true summit required traversing the knife-edge ridge, negotiating the Hillary Step area, steep, exposed terrain that had changed in recent years, and ascending the final slope to the highest point on Earth. Under normal conditions with supplemental oxygen, strong climbers completed this section in 90 minutes to 2 hours. Jennifer took nearly 3 hours. She reached the summit at 9:05 a.m., slumping hard into the snow at the highest point and staying there as if her body had simply run out of instructions. Other climbers took photos and began descending after brief celebrations. Jennifer remained staring up at the sky, her chest heaving with each breath. Sewang knelt beside her and stated they needed to descend immediately. They had already exceeded a safe summit time, and Jennifer's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Jennifer's response came slowly, her words slurred. She had done it. She had summited Everest without oxygen. She had proven it was possible. Her speech was confused, her thoughts fragmented. She asked whether they had reached the summit yet despite sitting on it. She could not remember Sewang's name. These were symptoms of severe cerebral hypoxia, high-altitude cerebral edema beginning to take hold as her brain swelled from oxygen deprivation, pressure building inside her skull, and cognitive function failing. Sewang tried to place the oxygen mask on her face. Jennifer pushed his hands away with surprising force, stating she did not need it. She felt fine. The denial was itself a symptom. Altitude-induced cognitive impairment often prevented climbers from recognizing their own deterioration. Sewang managed to get the mask over her face and opened the valve to maximum flow, but Jennifer tore it off again within seconds. He radioed for assistance, requesting that other Sherpas higher on the mountain help with the descent. 2 Sherpas who had just summited with their clients began climbing back up, but the summit was already 900 vertical feet above the South Col, and every meter of altitude made rescue exponentially harder. The descent became a nightmare. Jennifer could barely walk. Her legs moved in uncoordinated jerks, each step threatening to send her tumbling down slopes that dropped thousands of feet. Sewang clipped his harness directly to hers, using his body to prevent falls, essentially carrying her weight down technical terrain where a single mistake would kill them both. Other climbers passed them, some offering assistance, most focused on their own survival. At approximately 10:30 a.m., descending between the true summit and the south summit, Jennifer collapsed completely. She fell to her knees, then forward onto her face, and did not move. Sewang rolled her over and checked her breathing. Shallow and irregular, her chest barely rising. Her lips were blue despite the oxygen bottle still attached to her pack. Her pupils were of unequal size, a sign of brain swelling. She had stopped shivering, indicating her body was shutting down its thermoregulation. The two Sherpas who had been climbing up to assist arrived and assessed the situation immediately. She was in rapid decline, likely already beyond the point where intervention could save her. At 28,500 feet, with a patient who was unconscious and deteriorating, the chance of successful rescue approached zero. They could try to drag her down, but doing so would put 3 lives at risk in an environment where rescue resources did not exist. Sewang refused to leave. He forced oxygen into her mouth. He slapped her face, trying to stimulate consciousness. He begged her to wake up and help with the descent. The other Sherpas watched long enough to see she wasn't coming back. Unresponsive, breathing failing, and sliding past the point where they could move her. Remaining longer risked everyone's lives. They needed to descend. Jennifer Pearson died at approximately 11 a.m. on May 19, 2016, at 28,500 feet on Mount Everest's southeast ridge. The official cause was high-altitude cerebral edema, secondary to severe hypoxia, compounded by exhaustion and hypothermia. She was 39 years old. Her body remained where she died. The altitude, technical terrain, and her weight made recovery impossible without helicopter support, and helicopters could not operate at that elevation. She became one of the well over 100 bodies that remain on Everest, passed by climbers attempting the same summit she reached and could not descend from. The investigation concluded Jennifer had refused supplemental oxygen against her guide's explicit warnings. Sewang's statements, radio communications, and witness testimony from other climbers confirmed he had repeatedly attempted to prevent her decision and had tried to save her after she collapsed. The expedition company faced no penalties. Jennifer's family released a statement, noting she died pursuing a goal she had trained for years to achieve. Sewang Rinji guided one more Everest expedition the following season, then retired from high-altitude mountaineering at age 44. He used his savings to open a small trekking lodge in Namche Bazaar, where he now guides trekkers on lower-altitude routes that don't require making life-or-death decisions in the death zone.
It was April 28, 2015. Camp 2 perched precariously on a rocky ledge at 21,300 feet, where every drop of water was precious and fuel supplies meant the difference between survival and death. The extreme altitude and harsh conditions made resource management critical for survival in this unforgiving environment. Evangeline Worthington Blake was 38, a corporate compliance officer from Massachusetts whose career centered on identifying contamination risks and enforcing cleanliness standards. She approached every situation with checklists and protocols, believing that proper procedures could eliminate any risk. Her outdoor experience consisted of day hikes in New England and 2 weekend camping trips, but she had never used mountaineering equipment or slept above 3,000 feet. She viewed Everest as the ultimate test of her systematic approach to risk management and had researched every possible contamination scenario. High-altitude camping requires careful resource management, as every supply must be carried up from lower elevations at great physical cost. Fuel for melting snow becomes critically important as natural water sources disappear above base camp elevations. The extreme cold and dry air create additional challenges for maintaining proper nutrition and hydration levels. Shared facilities and communal cooking arrangements become essential for conserving precious resources in the harsh mountain environment. Evangeline questioned the sanitation procedures for shared cooking equipment and demanded written protocols for every cleaning procedure. She requested that communal areas be cleaned with disinfectant before each use and insisted on inspecting other climbers' personal hygiene practices. She hoarded extra oxygen canisters and fuel supplies, arguing she needed backup supplies for safety reasons that others didn't understand. She refused to share cooking duties, stating that others didn't meet her cleanliness standards, and demanded that meal preparation be done separately from the group kitchen area. When other climbers used the communal water station, she complained they weren't washing their hands frequently enough and posed contamination risk to the entire expedition. On the morning of April 30th, Evangeline's personal fuel supply ran critically low after 2 days of solo snow melting. She had been consuming approximately 2 liters of water daily, well below the recommended amount. At 11:30 a.m., she approached the communal water station but refused to use it after observing other climbers handling the equipment. Her attempts to maintain sterile conditions became increasingly desperate as her water supply dwindled. She spent precious time wiping down equipment with sanitizing wipes that froze solid in the extreme cold, making them useless. Other climbers watched as she repeatedly cleaned the same surfaces, obsessing over imaginary contamination, while her dehydration worsened. Her movements became more erratic as she searched through her supplies for alternative purification methods. The irony of her situation became apparent to observers as she chose potential death over using shared equipment. Her hoarded fuel supplies sat unused in her tent while she rationed her remaining water to dangerous levels. Fellow climbers offered to help melt snow using their equipment, but she refused each offer, claiming their methods didn't meet her safety standards. Her voice became increasingly hoarse as dehydration affected her ability to speak clearly. She attempted to melt snow using her remaining fuel, but the canister was nearly empty. The melting process yielded less than 500 milliliters of water. By 2 p.m., she was showing signs of severe dehydration, dizziness, confusion, and dark urine. She became increasingly irrational, accusing other climbers of contaminating her supplies. At 4:15 p.m., she collapsed outside her tent. Other climbers found her unconscious with a weak pulse and extremely dry mucous membranes. Emergency rehydration was immediately initiated by a climber with medical training using expedition medical supplies. Radio contact was established with Base Camp Medical at 4:20 p.m. Due to her condition and the camp's elevation, helicopter evacuation was impossible. The medical team attempted aggressive rehydration, but her kidneys had already begun shutting down from prolonged dehydration. Evangeline died at 11:45 p.m. on April 30th. The expedition doctor's report listed cause of death as acute renal failure, secondary to severe dehydration. Contributing factors included refusal to utilize available water sources and inadequate fluid intake over 72 hours. Her unused hoarded supplies were redistributed to other climbers. It was April 18, 2013. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was just beginning. The Khumbu Icefall had been equipped with fixed ropes and aluminum ladders. For climbers, the icefall represented the first major hazard, where avalanches, collapsing ice towers, and hidden crevasses could kill without warning. Bethany Prescott was 44 from Greenwich, Connecticut. She belonged to an exclusive country club where competition was constant. The previous year, a woman from her social circle had climbed Everest and given a presentation at the club. Bethany decided she would climb Everest as well, hiring a less expensive expedition company. She'd done minimal physical training, reasoning that she attended Pilates 3 times per week. She told friends she wanted to give her own presentation at the club the following year. During the trek to base camp, Bethany complained constantly. At base camp, her lack of preparation became obvious. Altitude affected her more severely than other clients. She spent 3 days with a severe headache and nausea. The expedition doctor recommended an extra acclimatization day. Bethany refused, stating she was on a schedule. The first acclimatization rotation was scheduled for April 18th. Climb through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet. Spend 1 night, then descend. The Khumbu Icefall is a river of ice, moving several feet per day. This movement causes ice to fracture constantly, creating ice blocks the size of houses, deep crevasses, and unstable towers called seracs that can collapse without warning. Climbers cross using fixed ropes and ladders, typically starting around 2 or 3 a.m. when ice is most stable. As the sun warms the icefall becomes progressively more dangerous. By mid-morning, collapse risk increases dramatically. Experienced climbers aim to be through by 8 or 9 a.m. The expedition leader briefed the team the evening before. They would wake at 1:30 a.m. and begin climbing at 2:30 a.m. Bethany objected immediately, stating 1:30 a.m. was unreasonable. The leader explained this was standard protocol and non-negotiable. After 20 minutes, Bethany reluctantly agreed. At 1:30 a.m. on April 18th, the team began waking. Bethany had not gotten up. At 2 a.m., the leader found her still in her sleeping bag. The leader explained the group stayed together for safety. Bethany argued she would climb on her own schedule. The leader compromised. Bethany could depart at 4 a.m. with an assistant guide. The main group departed at 2:30 a.m. and reached Camp 1 by 7 a.m. Bethany and her assistant departed at 4 a.m. The crossing was slow. By 7 a.m., they were roughly halfway. The sun was up and temperature was rising. The assistant became increasingly concerned. They were entering the dangerous period. He urged Bethany to move faster. By 8:30 a.m., they were approximately two-thirds through. Temperature had risen above freezing. The icefall was audibly active, constant creaking and groaning. Small chunks were falling from seracs. At approximately 9 a.m., they were beneath a massive ice serac, a tower roughly 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide, leaning at an angle. The serac was marked with warning flags. Standard protocol was to move through quickly. The assistant told Bethany they needed to move through quickly without stopping. Bethany stated she needed to rest first. The guide explained firmly they could not rest here. Bethany sat down and said she needed 5 minutes. The guide told Bethany that if she didn't start moving in 60 seconds, he would descend without her. The guide started counting down. At 30 seconds, Bethany stood up, angry, and started moving. They were approximately 50 feet past the serac, with perhaps another 100 feet before a clear, when the serac collapsed. There was no warning. Roughly 1,000 tons of ice fell and impacted the route. The assistant, ahead on the rope, heard the collapse and dove forward. He was hit by smaller chunks, knocked down and partially buried, but survived with injuries. Bethany was directly in the path of the main mass. She had no time to react. The ice hit her with tremendous force, killing her instantly. Her body was buried under several tons of ice blocks. The assistant freed himself and radioed for help. The rescue team reached the site within 90 minutes. The recovery operation took 2 full days. Bethany's body was located approximately 15 feet below the surface, crushed by the ice. Death had been instantaneous from massive trauma. The official investigation determined the serac collapse was a natural event that could not have been predicted with certainty. However, the investigation noted Bethany and her guide had been in the icefall during the dangerous late morning period when ice is most unstable, and that Bethany had delayed in a high-risk area despite warnings. It was April 19, 2016, at Everest Base Camp. As the pre-monsoon season hit its critical phase, the tent city at 17,600 feet buzzed with last-minute prep. Teams checking forecasts, Sherpas moving loads through the Khumbu icefall, and climbers dialing in gear before summit rotation. Prayer flags snapped over the gray moraine, and the afternoon hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough for down jackets, but still deceptively comfortable. The air smelled of kerosene stoves, raw, glacial ice, and drifting juniper incense from morning pujas. Among the climbers was Sarah Brennan, a 41-year-old management consultant from Denver who approached Everest with the same rigid intensity she brought to corporate work. Lean and marathon trained, she had completed 3 races in 18 months and spent countless hours training indoors, but her only high-altitude experience was a guided Kilimanjaro trek the year before. Despite warnings from reputable operators about her lack of technical experience, Sarah dismissed their concerns as gatekeeping and paid $78,000 to join a Kathmandu-based expedition willing to ask fewer questions. Sarah saw Everest as both reinvention and validation. After 20 years in corporate consulting, she watched younger colleagues build influence through personal branding and saw the mountain as her own transformation. She documented the process on Instagram, growing her following from a few hundred to nearly 8,000, framing the climb as proof that discipline and planning could turn ordinary people into something extraordinary. What Sarah's narrative omitted was any meaningful acknowledgement of the infrastructure that made commercial Everest expeditions possible. The Sherpas who established camps, fixed ropes, carried supplies, and guided clients through technical terrain appeared in her content primarily as background elements. When they did appear in photos, carrying loads through the icefall, preparing meals at camp, or managing logistics, they were rarely identified by name. She referred to them collectively as support staff or the team, language that reduced individuals to functional roles within her achievement story. Sarah's primary guide was Chewang Norbu, a 36-year-old from Phortse with 14 years of high-altitude experience. He had summited Everest 9 times and climbed Lhotse, Cho Oyu, and Manaslu, earning a reputation as a patient, reliable guide with a sharp eye for early signs of altitude illness. His income supported his wife and 3 children, funding their education in Kathmandu and tying every successful season directly to his family's future. The first signs of trouble appeared during the base camp orientation. While the expedition leader outlined acclimatization plans and safety protocols, Sarah sat scrolling through her phone, barely looking up when communication between clients and Sherpas was emphasized as critical to survival. Chi Wang noticed but said nothing, knowing some clients only paid attention once the mountain forced them to. After the briefing, Sarah approached him with a checklist of demands: how her gear should be organized, where her tent should face, and how her sleeping bag should be handled. Chi Wang explained that some requests fell outside standard Sherpa duties, but Sarah pushed back, reminding him she had paid premium rates and expected premium service. Chi Wang stayed calm and told her he would support her climb as safely as possible. The pattern became clear quickly. Sarah treated Chi Wang less like a climbing partner and more like personal staff, asking him to fetch water, carry her camera gear, and drop conversations to meet her requests. When he tried to explain pacing and altitude strategy, she brushed it off, insisting her marathon training meant she understood her limits better than he did. What concerned Chi Wang more than her attitude was her fundamental lack of technical skill. During a practice session on fixed ropes near base camp, he watched her clip and unclip from anchors with movements that were slow and uncertain. She fumbled with her ascender, twisting it the wrong way before correcting herself. Her crampon technique on steep ice showed no familiarity with efficient foot placement. She stabbed at the surface, rather than using her ankle flex to engage the front points properly. These were skills that should have been automatic for anyone attempting Everest. Their absence suggested that Sarah's preparation had been almost entirely cardiovascular rather than technical, a dangerous imbalance that altitude would expose ruthlessly. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 began on April the 25th. The route required navigating the Khumbu Icefall, a constantly shifting maze of crevasses and unstable ice towers that extended roughly 2,000 vertical feet up the lower slopes. Teams departed at 4 in the morning, moving through the most dangerous sections in darkness, while the overnight cold kept the ice stable. The route wound between house-sized seracs, across aluminum ladders spanning deep crevasses, and up steep ice walls where fixed ropes provided security against falls. Objective hazards included seracs collapsing without warning, crevasses widening as the glacier shifted downslope, and ice blocks calving from towers as daytime warming weakened their structure. Experienced climbers moved through the ice fall quickly, minimizing time spent in the hazard zone. Sarah required 5 hours and 40 minutes to reach Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. Chi Wang stayed directly behind her throughout the ascent, monitoring her technique and watching for signs of exhaustion or altitude sickness. Her pace was painfully slow through the ladder crossings, each one preceded by long pauses where she tested the rungs multiple times before committing her weight. The ladders flexed and swayed over empty space, requiring balance and confidence she clearly lacked. Her breathing became labored above 18,500 feet, each inhalation producing a harsh rasping sound that indicated her respiratory system was already struggling to process the thinning air. By the time they reached Camp 1, the sun had risen high enough to warm the icefall, and Chi Wang could hear the ominous cracking sounds of ice shifting under thermal stress. They had spent far longer in the danger zone than any guide preferred. At Camp 1, after Sarah retreated to her tent without helping establish camp or melt snow for water, Chi Wang checked her oxygen saturation using his pulse oximeter. The reading showed 74%, low but not immediately critical at this altitude. Still, combined with her slow pace and labored breathing, it suggested her body was struggling to acclimatize. That evening, when Chi Wang tried to discuss pacing strategies for the next rotation, Sarah cut him off. She understood she had been slow. She would improve. She did not need a detailed analysis of her performance. The following morning, Sarah posted a photo of herself at Camp 1, with the icefall visible in the background. The caption described the technical challenges she had overcome, the mental toughness required to push through fear, and her growing confidence as she moved higher on the mountain. The post made no mention of Chi Wang or the other Sherpas who had guided her through every difficult section. The photo had been taken by Chi Wang at her request, yet he appeared nowhere in the narrative. Several other clients noticed the omission, but no one commented directly. In the tight social environment of base camp, calling out another climber's behavior created friction that people preferred to avoid. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet revealed the same pattern with greater intensity. The route traversed the western CWM, a broad glacial valley that became a furnace during midday when sunlight reflected off the surrounding ice walls. Temperatures could spike into the low 50s despite the altitude, creating conditions that dehydrated climbers rapidly and sapped energy. Sarah struggled badly in the heat, her pace dropping to 20 steps followed by extended rest periods. Her face flushed red beneath her glacier glasses, and sweat soaked through her base layers despite the altitude. At one point, she sat down in the snow and refused to move for nearly 20 minutes, her head bowed and her breathing ragged. When Chiwang knelt beside her and asked if she needed assistance, Sarah waved him away without making eye contact. She just needed a moment. She would be fine. Chiwang waited patiently, aware that pushing too hard could trigger defensive anger that made clients less likely to accept help when they genuinely needed it. After Sarah eventually stood and continued climbing, Chiwang noticed her coordination had deteriorated. She stumbled over small irregularities in the snow, and her foot placements lacked precision. These were early signs of altitude affecting her neurological function. At Camp 2 that evening, Chiwang attempted to discuss her condition more directly. Her oxygen saturation had dropped into the mid-60s, her coordination was impaired, and her pace suggested she was operating at the edge of her physical capacity at an altitude where many challenges still remained above. He recommended extending her acclimatization schedule, adding an extra rotation before attempting Camp 3, giving her body more time to adapt. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. She was following the same schedule as every other client. She would not accept delays based on subjective assessments. Chiwang tried to explain that acclimatization varied significantly between individuals, that some people adapted more slowly through no fault of their own, and that adjusting schedules was common practice. Sarah interrupted him. She had paid for a summit attempt on a specific timeline. She expected her guide to support that goal rather than creating obstacles. Other climbers in adjacent tents heard the exchange through the thin fabric walls. The conversation had been loud enough to carry, and Sarah's tone had been unmistakably dismissive. Chiwang retreated without further argument, understanding that pushing harder would only entrench her resistance. The breaking point came during the third rotation to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. The climb required ascending the Lhotse face, a continuous wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees that rose more than 3,700 vertical feet from the western CBM to the South Col. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained leg strength and cardiovascular capacity that altitude steadily depleted. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 6 hours. Sarah took 11 hours. They had started well before dawn, but her pace turned the face into an all-day ordeal that stretched far beyond what guides considered safe. Chiwang stayed with her the entire way, watching her deterioration with growing alarm. She stopped every 20 to 30 feet, her breathing shallow and rapid, her legs visibly trembling between efforts. Twice she nearly lost her balance, catching herself on the fixed rope while her crampons scraped uselessly across hard ice. Around 22,000 feet, she began making small technical errors that experienced climbers never made, forgetting to clip her safety carabiner before unclipping her ascender, pulling on the rope instead of stepping up with her legs, pausing mid-traverse where the angle demanded constant forward movement. Chiwang recognized the pattern. Her brain was being starved of oxygen, and her judgment was beginning to fail. When they finally reached Camp 3 in the late afternoon, Sarah collapsed into her tent without speaking. Chiwang gave her 30 minutes to rest, then brought warm tea and tried to conduct a proper assessment, the way guides actually did it at this altitude. Watching her eyes, her coordination, the lag in her responses, the way she struggled to track a simple question without losing the thread. Her oxygen saturation was difficult to capture in the cold. The oximeter flickered, failed, then finally stabilized long enough to show a reading in the high 50s. It was dangerously low even for this altitude. Her speech was slightly slurred when she asked how much higher they needed to go, and she repeated the question again, minutes later, as if it had never been answered. These were warning signs that could not be ignored. Chiwang stated clearly that they needed to descend immediately. Her body was showing early symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, brain swelling that could progress to coma and death within hours, if not reversed by losing altitude. Continuing upward would be dangerous. Descending was not optional. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Sarah's response stunned him. She demanded to know whether he gave the same recommendation to thinner climbers or whether he was singling her out based on appearance. Chiwang attempted to clarify that his assessment was based entirely on measurable medical indicators: oxygen saturation, coordination, speech patterns, and confusion, none of which had any relationship to body composition. Sarah was already committed to her interpretation. She accused him of applying discriminatory standards disguised as medical concern, of undermining her summit attempt through bias rather than legitimate safety considerations. The argument escalated beyond anything Chiwang had experienced in 14 years of guiding. Sarah raised her voice enough that climbers from 3 adjacent tents emerged to see what was happening. She stated loudly that Chiwang had been creating obstacles since base camp, that he had questioned her abilities repeatedly, and that he was now inventing medical emergencies to justify his prejudice. When Chiwang tried to show her the oximeter readings and explain what the numbers meant, Sarah knocked the device from his hand. It skittered across the ice and disappeared into a narrow crack between tent platforms. Then she delivered the accusation that cut deepest. She claimed that Chiwang was trying to force her descent because he wanted to pocket her summit bonus payment, typically split between Sherpas who successfully guided clients to the top without actually completing the work. By manufacturing a medical crisis, he could collect his fee while avoiding the difficult final push to the summit. She called him a scam artist and said she would be filing formal complaints with both the expedition company and Nepal's tourism ministry. She demanded that the expedition leader assign a different Sherpa immediately. The words carried across Camp 3 in the thin air. A dozen climbers and 4 other Sherpas heard the entire exchange. Chiwang stood motionless, his face showing nothing, but the other Sherpas present understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Accusations of financial dishonesty could end a guiding career permanently. The climbing community was small enough that reputations traveled quickly, and even unfounded claims created suspicion that made finding future work difficult. Chiwang had 3 children, whose education depended entirely on his seasonal income. He had never in 14 years abandoned a client or failed to prioritize their safety over his own comfort. He turned and walked away without responding, climbing down 50 feet to where other Sherpas had gathered. They spoke in Nepali, their voices low and angry. What Sarah had done went beyond rudeness into something that threatened Chiwang's livelihood and reputation. The expedition leader, contacted by radio, made a decision based on business calculations dressed up as de-escalation. Sarah was a paying client who had signed liability waivers. Unless she deteriorated into obvious incapacitation, the expedition would continue. The leader did not frame the reassignment as believing Sarah's claims, only as a way to quiet the conflict before it poisoned the team. A different Sherpa would be assigned, Dawa, younger and less experienced, who needed the work and would be less likely to push back against client demands. That evening, Sarah posted a photo from Camp 3 with the caption describing the challenges of dealing with guides who lacked confidence in their clients' abilities. She did not name Chiwang directly, but the implication was clear to anyone following her expedition updates. The post received hundreds of supportive comments from followers who praised her determination and criticized what they perceived as gatekeeping by insecure guides. Chiwang descended to Camp 2 the following morning, his role on Sarah's summit push finished. He tried one final time to communicate his concerns through the expedition leader, explaining that Sarah's condition made continuing upward genuinely dangerous. The leader acknowledged the concern, but stated the decision was ultimately Sarah's to make. She had chosen to continue with a different guide. The company would support her decision. The weather shifted in her favor on May 11th. Meteorologists predicted a stable 72-hour stretch of reduced winds and clear skies, conditions that would allow summit attempts from the South Col and keep traffic moving on the fixed lines. Sarah had spent the intervening time resting at base camp, and her oxygen saturation numbers had improved slightly at a lower altitude. She insisted on joining the summit push despite having shown no fundamental improvement in her acclimatization capacity. The expedition leader approved her attempt. Dawa, her new assigned Sherpa, was 28 years old with 3 Everest summits to his credit. He was competent but lacked Chiwang's experience in reading subtle signs of deterioration. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 at 26,000 feet required 2 days with overnight stops at Camps 2 and 3. Sarah moved slowly but steadily, her pace mechanical and her conversation minimal. At Camp 4, Perched on the South Col where winds screamed across exposed ice at -30 degrees Fahrenheit, Dawa checked her oxygen saturation before she went on oxygen for the final summit push. The device struggled in the cold, blinking error messages until he warmed her fingers inside his gloves. When it finally caught a stable signal, the best reading it showed was in the low 50s, critically low, and exactly the kind of number that made every decision at this altitude feel like gambling with loaded dice. He asked how she felt. She said she was ready. They departed for the summit at 11:30 p.m. on May 13th, part of a long chain of headlamps ascending the southeast ridge toward the top of the world. Sarah moved upward with Dawa directly behind her, both climbers breathing bottled oxygen through regulators that hissed with each inhalation. The cold was savage, -45 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, but Sarah's layers and supplemental oxygen kept her functional through the initial hours. For a brief period, it seemed possible she might defy everyone's predictions. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, the deterioration began. Sarah's rest stops extended from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, then longer. Her breathing became rapid and shallow despite the oxygen flowing into her mask. When Dawa tried to recheck her saturation, the oximeter barely cooperated, numbers flickering in the low 40s before disappearing altogether. She stumbled repeatedly, catching herself on the fixed rope but showing the impaired coordination that accompanied cerebral hypoxia. Dawa stayed close, checking her mask connections to ensure proper flow. Other climbers passed them, moving steadily toward the summit in the pre-dawn darkness. At 28,000 feet, with roughly 800 vertical feet remaining to the summit, Sarah stopped climbing and asked whether they had already reached the top. Dawa told her they had not, that the summit was still above them, that they needed to keep moving. She nodded and took several more steps before stopping again to ask the same question. Dawa recognized the confusion as severe cerebral hypoxia, sliding into full-blown edema, cognitive function collapsing as the altitude exceeded her body's ability to survive it. He stated firmly that they needed to descend immediately. Continuing upward would kill her. Sarah's response was to sit down in the snow and refuse to move. She insisted the summit was close, that she had not come this far to quit, that Dawa was repeating the same discriminatory behavior Chiwang had shown. Her words were slurred, and her reasoning was incoherent, but her determination remained fixed. Dawa tried to help her stand. She pushed his hands away with surprising force. The turnaround time had already passed. Dawn was approaching. They were out of margins. What followed was a struggle with physics rather than will. Sarah had ceased functioning as a climbing partner and become a weight that needed to be moved down technical terrain in the death zone. Dawa clipped her harness into the fixed line and tried to guide her down in controlled segments. She could not maintain her balance. Her legs buckled randomly. Her hands slipped off the rope despite his repeated instructions to maintain her grip. After 30 minutes of minimal progress, Dawa radioed for assistance. 2 other Sherpas nearby on the fixed line diverted to help, and the 3 men fought for every inch, lowering her a few feet, resetting, untangling gear, waiting for rope traffic to clear, then lowering again. Over the next 2 hours, they managed less than 100 vertical feet, and even that progress felt like it had been paid for with pieces of their own lives. At roughly 27,700 feet, shortly after sunrise, on May 14th, Sarah lost consciousness completely. Dawa cleared ice from her oxygen mask and confirmed the bottle was still flowing, but she did not respond when he shook her shoulders and called her name. He checked for a pulse at her neck and found it, rapid, weak, and irregular. Her breathing had become shallow and sporadic, each breath separated by long pauses that suggested her brain stem was beginning to fail. The 3 Sherpas continued lowering her body, fighting gravity and their own exhaustion in air that left even healthy climbers operating on borrowed time. Sarah Brennan stopped breathing at approximately 7:40 a.m., somewhere near 27,400 feet on the southeast ridge. Dawa confirmed no pulse and attempted rescue breathing out of reflex, more than hope, trying to force life back through a system that the altitude had already shut down. At that elevation, with her brain massively swollen and her body failing, there was no possibility of revival. The cause was the same one Chiwang had identified and warned about 9 days earlier at Camp 3, high-altitude cerebral edema. She was 41 years old. The Sherpas marked the location and descended, leaving Sarah's body where it fell. Recovery at that altitude was impossible given the terrain and conditions. She would remain on the mountain, one of more than 200 bodies scattered across Everest's upper slopes, most passed by climbers who never learned their names. In the days that followed, Sherpas returned to recover her equipment and document the death. Chi Wang volunteered for one of those trips and spent nearly 4 hours above 27,000 feet as weather deteriorated. Winds rising, hardware freezing, ropes turning rigid. Repeatedly removing his gloves to free frozen gear cost him several fingers to frostbite, ending his climbing career at 36. The investigation later concluded that responsibility lay with Sarah's decision to continue despite clear warning signs. No fault was assigned to the Sherpas. The season moved on, and Everest filled again with climbers convinced that determination could overpower the mountain. It was April 22nd, 2015. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was underway, with expedition teams making acclimatization rotations. At base camp at 17,600 feet, climbers were preparing for their second rotation. Tessa Hargrove was 39, a lifestyle blogger from Scottsdale, Arizona. Everest was her most ambitious project, a series she'd pre-sold to outdoor gear companies as sponsored content. She'd spent more money on camera equipment than proper cold weather gear. Her jacket was rated only to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, inadequate for Everest where temperatures drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. During the trek to base camp, Tessa complained constantly about accommodations, food, and pace. She treated porters dismissively, referring to them as the help. At tea houses, she insisted on private rooms and threatened bad reviews when told she'd have to share. During the first rotation, Tessa stopped frequently for photos, forcing others to wait. When teammates expressed frustration, she responded that her sponsors expected content and she was paying for the expedition. At Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, she spent 2 hours staging tent photos while teammates rested. On April 22nd, the team began their second rotation through the Khumbu Icefall. The climb started at 3 a.m. when ice was most stable. Tessa moved slowly, stopping repeatedly. Other climbers had to navigate around her. When her guide urged her to maintain pace, she snapped that he was being unprofessional and she'd document his attitude for the expedition company. At one point, she removed her gloves for 5 minutes to operate her camera in -15 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, demanding her guide hold her ice axe. Her fingers turned white, then red. The guide told her to put gloves back on. Tessa accused him of overreacting. They reached Camp 1 and continued to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet the next day. At Camp 2, Tessa's oxygen saturation was 68%, acceptable. She complained of headache and fatigue, but dismissed these as minor. The plan was to rest briefly, then descend to Camp 1 before nightfall. At 2 p.m., as the team prepared to descend, Tessa announced she was staying longer to photograph the Lhotse face. Her guide explained they needed to descend before afternoon heat destabilized the route. Tessa responded that her sponsors expected specific shots, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. She'd paid for this expedition and would decide when to leave. After heated argument, the guide gave her a deadline, 2:30 p.m. Tessa spent 30 minutes taking photographs, changing jackets 3 times for different looks. She demanded other climbers move out of her frame. Each time she removed layers, her body lost heat. By departure, her fingers were numb. The guide examined her hands. Early frostbite. Tessa blamed him for not warning her properly. The descent was slow. Tessa's coordination was impaired. She stumbled repeatedly. By 4 p.m., they'd only descended halfway. At approximately 19,800 feet, Tessa sat down, saying she needed rest. The guide checked her oxygen saturation, 62%. Her speech was slurred. He urged her to continue. She stood but sat back down, reporting dizziness and nausea. The guide recognized acute mountain sickness and administered emergency oxygen. The oxygen helped initially, but Tessa couldn't walk. The guide and assistant began dragging her downward. Progress was agonizingly slow. At approximately 5:15 p.m., at 19,600 feet, Tessa suddenly pulled away and stumbled sideways off the route. She took 3 steps onto untracked snow. The snow collapsed beneath her. She'd stepped onto a snow bridge, covering a crevasse. The bridge gave way, and Tessa fell through. The guide rushed to the edge. The crevasse was 8 feet wide, narrowing as it descended. He could see Tessa approximately 40 feet down, wedged between ice walls, not moving. He called her name repeatedly. No response. He radioed an emergency call. A rescue team arrived 90 minutes later after dark. A rescuer descended and reached Tessa 40 feet below the surface. Wedged between ice walls, the rescuer checked for vital signs. None. Tessa was dead. Her oxygen mask had been torn off during the fall. Recovery took 3 hours. Tessa's body was brought to Camp 1, then carried to base camp the next day. The official cause of death was trauma from the fall, combined with hypoxia and hypothermia. Contributing factors included altitude sickness, inadequate cold weather gear leading to frostbite, and exhaustion from prioritizing photography over proper acclimatization. The guide's logs documented repeated warnings, her dismissive responses, and threats regarding his conduct. Her camera was recovered with her body, containing hundreds of photos from the days before her death. The expedition company added protocols requiring guides to confiscate cameras if clients prioritized photography over safety. Tessa Hargrove's body was returned to Arizona for burial. It was May 19th, 2018. The Hillary Step area at 28,700 feet marked the final technical challenge before Everest's summit, where climbers moved through the death zone with only minutes of survival time without supplemental oxygen. The extreme altitude and harsh conditions made every breath a struggle and every movement a calculated risk. Araminta Fairweatherstone was 47, a frequent complainant from an affluent suburb who maintained detailed records of every unsatisfactory service experience and regularly demanded refunds or compensation. She operated under the belief that paying premium prices guaranteed perfect outcomes and that any disappointment warranted immediate correction. Araminta had never climbed anything higher than a local hiking trail and had no outdoor experience beyond day trips to scenic overlooks. She selected Everest specifically because it was the most expensive and prestigious climbing goal available, viewing it as the ultimate luxury adventure experience. The final approach to Everest's summit pushes climbers through the most extreme conditions on Earth, where every step requires maximum effort and minimum oxygen. The technical climbing sections demand precise movements while wearing bulky protective gear in sub-zero temperatures. Weather windows for summit attempts are measured in hours, creating intense pressure to maintain pace regardless of physical condition. The psychological stress of achieving a lifelong goal can cloud judgment at the exact moment when clear thinking becomes most critical for survival. Araminta demanded detailed explanations for every aspect of the climbing schedule and route selection, insisting on reviewing and approving all promotional materials used by the expedition company. She complained that the base camp facilities didn't match the website descriptions and requested written guarantees about summit success rates and weather conditions. She demanded that guides provide constant updates on her progress compared to other climbers. She insisted on receiving daily reports about expedition performance metrics and threatened to leave negative reviews and demand refunds if any aspect of the experience was unsatisfactory. Her complaints focused on false advertising and unmet expectations rather than safety concerns or climbing preparation. At 7:30 a.m. on May 20th, approximately 150 feet below the summit, Araminta began experiencing chest tightness and shortness of breath beyond normal altitude effects. She attributed the symptoms to poor expedition planning and continued climbing while complaining about false advertising. At 8:15 a.m., she reached the summit but immediately began criticizing its appearance and demanding explanations for the discrepancy with promotional photos. The summit's appearance failed to meet her expectations based on professional photographs she had seen in marketing materials. She complained loudly about the lack of clear views due to clouds and demanded to know why the expedition company hadn't guaranteed better weather conditions. Her voice became increasingly strained as she berated her guide about the summit's disappointing size and unremarkable features. Other climbers watched in disbelief as she threatened to demand a partial refund for the substandard summit experience. Her agitation and physical exertion in the extreme altitude began taking a severe toll on her cardiovascular system. The combination of her hidden heart condition, extreme altitude, and emotional stress created a perfect storm for cardiac failure. She continued her complaints even as her breathing became labored, insisting that the expedition company had misrepresented the summit experience. Her face began showing signs of oxygen deprivation, but she attributed her discomfort to anger rather than medical emergency. The extreme exertion combined with altitude stress triggered severe chest pain. She collapsed at 8:25 a.m. while posing for summit photos. Other climbers observed her clutching her chest and gasping for air. Her lips turned blue, and she lost consciousness within 2 minutes. A climber with medical training immediately began CPR, while others administered supplemental oxygen. Radio contact with Base Camp Medical was established at 8:30 a.m. Due to the extreme altitude and weather conditions, helicopter evacuation was impossible. The medical team attempted resuscitation for 45 minutes, but her heart rhythm could not be restored. Araminta was pronounced dead at 9:10 a.m. on the summit of Mount Everest. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as massive myocardial infarction, triggered by extreme altitude and physical stress. Contributing factors included concealment of pre-existing cardiac condition and failure to disclose relevant medical history. Investigation revealed prescription heart medication in her personal belongings that had not been reported during medical screening. It was April 23, 2017, at Everest Base Camp, where the spring climbing season was entering its crucial preparation phase. The sprawling tent city at 17,600 feet buzzed with the controlled chaos of 14 expedition teams finalizing acclimatization schedules and equipment checks. Prayer flags snapped in the thin wind, their colors brilliant against the white expanse of the Khumbu Glacier. Temperatures hovered around 25 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours, cold enough that climbers moved between tents in heavy down jackets, but warm enough that the camp felt almost hospitable compared to what waited above. The air carried the familiar sense of base camp life, kerosene from cooking stoves, the sharp ozone smell of glacier ice, and the earthy smoke of juniper burned in morning pujas. Among the climbers was Deborah Mitchell, a 42-year-old real estate executive from Dallas, who had arrived in Nepal 3 weeks earlier with a mission that extended far beyond the summit. At 240 pounds and 5'6", Deborah represented something she believed Everest desperately needed, proof that high-altitude mountaineering wasn't exclusive to the lean, elite climbers who dominated expedition rosters and Instagram feeds. She had spent 18 months training for this climb, completing 2 marathons and maintaining a rigorous gym schedule that left her genuinely fit by conventional standards. What she lacked was any meaningful high-altitude experience. Deborah's path to Everest had been shaped by a divorce 2 years earlier. Her ex-husband had been a triathlete who made casual comments about her weight, disguised as health concerns, observations that accumulated like small cuts until the marriage became unsustainable. After the divorce, Deborah threw herself into fitness with something that resembled vengeance. Kilimanjaro had been her first summit in 2016, standing at 19,341 feet above Tanzania. She had felt a validation that no boardroom success had ever provided. The experience convinced her that mountains cared nothing about appearance, only effort. It was a comforting belief that happened to be dangerously incomplete. Her climbing resume consisted of that single high-altitude entry. Kilimanjaro required endurance, but minimal technical skill, a week-long trek where altitude sickness was manageable and descent was always an option. When reputable Everest operators questioned her lack of experience, Deborah interpreted their concerns as discrimination rather than legitimate safety assessments. She eventually found a smaller Nepali operator willing to accept her $85,000 payment with minimal screening. The Sherpas assigned to Deborah were Mingma Dorje, 48 years old, and his nephew Dawa, 26, both from Namche Bazaar. Mingma had summited Everest 14 times across a 22-year guiding career. His face showed the weathering of decades spent at extreme altitude, deep lines around his eyes from squinting against glacier glare, skin darkened and toughened by wind and cold. He supported 3 children whose education consumed most of his guiding income. His oldest daughter was studying engineering in Kathmandu at a university that cost more annually than many Sherpa families earned in 3 years. The tuition payment was due in 3 weeks, and Mingma had exactly enough saved if this expedition paid out as contracted. Walking away from a $6,000 guiding fee, split between the 2 men, would jeopardize everything his family had worked toward. Dawa had completed 4 Everest summits and was engaged to be married in August, the wedding funded entirely by his climbing income. He possessed less diplomatic patience than his uncle, a directness that had occasionally cost him work. Where Mingma had learned to swallow frustrations for the sake of employment, Dawa still believed honesty mattered more than client comfort. Mingma valued his nephew's integrity, even when it created friction, believing that silence in the mountains killed more people than uncomfortable conversations. The problems began during the first camp meeting. when Mingma attempted to review safety protocols with the 12 clients assigned to their expedition company. Deborah sat at the back scrolling through her phone, responding to social media comments on her most recent post about breaking barriers on the world's highest mountain. The post had generated significant engagement, nearly 4,000 likes and hundreds of supportive comments from followers who saw her expedition as a representation that mattered. When Mingma explained the importance of efficient movement through the Khumbu Icefall, the objective hazard zone where speed meant survival and delays could trap climbers beneath unstable seracs during the warmest hours, Deborah looked up briefly and said she understood, then returned to her screen without asking questions. The following morning, Deborah emerged from her tent with a handwritten list of requests. She wanted Mingma and Dawa to carry her camera equipment, a professional DSLR with 2 lenses that added 4 pounds, along with spare clothing layers and portable charging equipment for her social media documentation. When Mingma explained that Sherpas carried group equipment, safety gear, and emergency supplies rather than personal items, Deborah's response came sharp and immediate. She had paid premium rates specifically for premium service, and carrying her gear was part of that service. The expedition leader, Tenzing, sided with Deborah. The additional weight was reasonable. The Sherpas would accommodate it. Mingma accepted the decision without further argument, understanding that the power structure of commercial expeditions did not reward Sherpa objections to client demands. Over the following days, Mingma and Dawa developed a private catalog of grievances shared only in Nepali. She complained about her tent placement 3 separate times. She criticized the expedition's food. She referred to the Sherpas in her social media posts as my team and my guides, language that reduced them to accessories in her narrative rather than the experienced mountaineers whose judgment would determine whether she lived or died above 26,000 feet. During group discussions, she interrupted Mingma multiple times to ask basic questions that had already been answered in the briefing she had ignored. Dawa expressed his frustration to Mingma during a load carry to Camp 1, speaking quietly as they climbed alone through the icefall in pre-dawn darkness. The client treated them like hotel staff rather than climbing partners, and her physical condition concerned him more than her attitude. She moved slowly, even at base camp, her breathing heavier than it should be during simple tasks. Mingma agreed, but offered no solution beyond patience and observation. The first acclimatization rotation began on April 28th. The climb to Camp 1 required navigating the Khumbu Icefall, a chaotic maze of crevasses, unstable seracs, and aluminum ladders that shifted daily as the glacier ground downslope. The route measured approximately 2,000 vertical feet and typically required 3 to 4 hours for acclimatized climbers. Objective hazards, seracs collapsing without warning, shifting ladders over widening slots, and ice towers shedding blocks as the sun warmed the glacier meant that time in the hazard zone needed to be minimized. Teams departed before dawn, moving through the worst sections while overnight cold kept the ice stiffer and reduced the odds of seracs shifting or collapsing as the sun rose. Deborah required nearly 7 hours to reach Camp 1. By the final ladders, Mingma could feel the day warming under his crampons, and he knew they'd spent far longer in the icefall than any guide would ever want. Her pace through the technical sections was painfully slow, each ladder crossing preceded by long pauses where she tested the rungs repeatedly before committing her weight. The ladders, sometimes 3 or 4 lashed together to span wide crevasses whose bottoms disappeared into blue shadow, flexed and swayed with each step, requiring balance and confidence that Deborah clearly lacked. The rope team behind her waited without complaint initially, but the delays accumulated. By the time they emerged from the icefall's upper section, the sun had risen high enough to warm the ice, and the sharp cracks of shifting seracs echoed across the glacier like distant thunder. Mingma climbed directly behind Deborah throughout the ascent. He watched her crampon technique, noting that her foot placements lacked confidence and her balance seemed uncertain on steep terrain. She crossed her feet while traversing, a beginner mistake that risked snagging and falling. These were fundamental skills that should have been mastered long before attempting Everest. At Camp 1, after she disappeared into her tent without helping with camp tasks, Mingma checked her oxygen saturation using his pulse oximeter. The reading showed 73%, low but not immediately dangerous at 19,500 2,500 feet. 73% was concerning, but not shocking at that altitude, where even acclimatized climbers often read in the 70s depending on cold, fatigue, and circulation. Still, it suggested her body was struggling to adapt, a warning sign that would become critical at higher camps where margins disappeared. The second rotation to Camp 2 revealed the same pattern. The climb from Camp 1 traversed the western CWM, a vast glacial valley that became a heat trap during midday when the sun reflected off surrounding ice walls. Temperatures could rise into the 50s despite the 21,000-foot altitude, creating conditions that dehydrated climbers rapidly and accelerated exhaustion. The route stretched for miles across relatively flat terrain, crisscrossed with crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges. Fixed ropes guided the way, but the distance and the furnace heat made the approach to Camp 2 a grinding test of endurance. Sweat soaked through Deborah's base layers, despite the altitude, and she removed her shell jacket within the first hour, stuffing it clumsily into her pack, while other climbers moved past her on the rope line. Deborah struggled badly in the heat. Her pace dropped to 20 steps, followed by extended rest. Her face flushed red beneath her glacier glasses, and her movements increasingly uncoordinated. At one point, she sat down in the snow and did not move for nearly 15 minutes, her head bowed and her chest heaving. When Dawa asked if she could continue, she waved him off without speaking. At Camp 2, she immediately demanded that Mingma and Dawa melt additional water and bring meals to her tent. When Mingma checked her oxygen saturation that evening, it had dropped to 68% at rest, and paired with her exhaustion and coordination issues, it was enough to make him worry about what might happen if she worsened. He explained carefully that continuing upward with declining numbers increased the risk of pulmonary or cerebral edema, swelling in the lungs or brain that could worsen fast without immediate descent. Deborah's response stunned both Sherpas. She accused Mingma of treating her differently because of her body type, of applying standards that wouldn't be raised for thinner climbers. She was being targeted with fat phobia, disguised as a medical concern. Mingma attempted to clarify that oxygen saturation measurements were objective data unrelated to body type, that the device measured blood oxygen levels without regard to weight or appearance. He mentioned that other clients at similar altitudes had tested higher, that the numbers indicated her body specifically was struggling to process oxygen. Deborah had already decided the conversation was discriminatory. She turned away without responding, ending the discussion before it could go further. Deborah contacted Tenzing via radio and complained that her Sherpas were creating a hostile environment. Tenzing's response, delivered during a private conversation with Mingma the following morning, made the power structure clear. Deborah was a paying client who had signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks. Unless she deteriorated into something undeniable, confusion, inability to walk, or obvious respiratory distress, the expedition would continue. The Sherpas needed to maintain professional conduct and avoid conflicts that could damage the company's reputation. Client complaints spread quickly through the tight network of expedition operators, and difficult Sherpas found themselves unemployed regardless of their experience. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. The third rotation to Camp 3 revealed the full scope of Deborah's inadequacy. The climb from Camp 2 required ascending the Lhotse face, a 2,300 vertical foot wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained leg strength and cardiovascular capacity that altitude steadily depleted. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Deborah took 9 hours and 15 minutes. Dawa stayed with her the entire way, watching her deterioration with growing alarm. She stopped every 30 to 40 feet, her breathing shallow and rapid, her legs trembling visibly between efforts. Twice she nearly lost her footing, catching herself on the fixed rope while her crampons scraped uselessly across hard ice. The trembling in her legs worsened as they climbed higher, the muscle fatigue compounding with oxygen deprivation, until even standing still became an act of will. Around 22,000 feet, she began making small errors that experienced climbers never made, forgetting to unclip her safety before moving to the next anchor, pulling on the rope instead of stepping up with her legs, pausing mid-traverse where the angle demanded constant movement. Dawa watched each mistake accumulate into a pattern he'd seen before, always in climbers who were hours away from complete failure. The mountain was grinding her down cell by cell, and the summit was still 7,500 feet above them. On the fixed lines, even simple transitions, clipping, unclipping, and began sliding her ascender, stopped being automatic and started taking effort she didn't have. At one point, roughly 2/3 up the face, she simply stopped and stared at the ice without moving, her eyes unfocused and her expression distant, as if she had forgotten where she was. When they finally reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, Deborah collapsed into her tent and did not emerge for the rest of the evening. Dawa found Mingma and stated clearly that continuing the expedition would kill their client. Her physical condition had crossed from struggling to failing. Her oxygen saturation at Camp 3 measured 64% at rest, a number that, combined with her confusion and coordination problems, put cerebral edema on the table. They needed to descend immediately. Mingma agreed completely, but had no power to enforce it. He radioed Tenzing and delivered the same recommendation. An hour later, Deborah's voice came through the radio, crackling with altitude-thinned air and absolute determination. She felt fine. The climb had been hard, but she had made it. She was continuing to the summit. The Sherpas could either support her decision, or she would file formal complaints about their unprofessional conduct, which would include social media exposure about discrimination and prejudice in Nepali guiding companies. The threat carried weight that technical arguments and medical data could not overcome. A single viral social media post accusing him of discrimination could end Mingma's career permanently. Dawa's wedding required the income this climb provided. Walking away would brand them as difficult Sherpas who abandoned clients. They descended to base camp with Deborah in silence, preparing for the summit push. Neither believed she would survive. The weather window opened on May 18th. Meteorologists predicted a 36-hour period of reduced winds and clear skies. Deborah insisted on joining the push despite having shown no improvement during her rest period. If anything, she appeared thinner and more exhausted than before, her face gaunt and her movements slow. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 required 2 days, with overnight stops at Camp 2. They touched Camp 3 only long enough to reset gear and oxygen before continuing upward. Deborah moved like someone operating on fumes, her pace steady but ominously mechanical. At Camp 4, 26,000 feet into the death zone, Mingma checked her oxygen saturation one final time before the summit push. After warming her hands and taking multiple readings, the best number they could coax from the oximeter was still ugly, 61%, even after they briefly put her on oxygen ahead of schedule and tried to stabilize her breathing. Mingma made his last attempt to stop what he knew was about to happen. He knelt beside Deborah in her tent while the wind battered the fabric. He spoke with careful precision, measuring each word. Her oxygen levels indicated severe hypoxia. Her body was not getting enough oxygen to sustain basic functions. If she continued upward, she would lose consciousness, somewhere above 27,000 feet. At that altitude, rescue was impossible. She would die on the mountain, and there was nothing he or Dawa could do to prevent it. He begged her to descend, while she could still walk under her own power. Deborah's response came without hesitation. She had not spent $85,000 and 18 months training to quit within sight of the summit. If she died trying, at least she would die attempting something meaningful. She ordered them to prepare for departure at 11:30 that night. The summit push began under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. Deborah moved upward with Mingma in front and Dawa behind, the three of them part of a long chain of headlamps ascending toward the southeast ridge. The cold was brutal, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, but Deborah's layers held, and her extremities remained functional. For the first 2 hours, she maintained a pace that suggested she might defy the Sherpas' predictions. The rhythm of movement, step, breathe, slide a glove along the fixed line, breathe again, became meditative in the darkness. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, the deterioration accelerated. Deborah's rest stops extended from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, then longer. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, each exhale accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that made Dawa think of climbers whose lungs were starting to fail. She stumbled repeatedly, catching herself on the fixed rope, but showing the impaired coordination that accompanied cerebral hypoxia. Other climbers passed them, moving steadily toward the summit. Some offered words of encouragement. Most said nothing, focused entirely on their own survival. At 28,000 feet, with 800 vertical feet remaining to the summit, Deborah asked whether they had already summited. Mingma told her they had not, that the summit was still above them, that they needed to keep moving. She nodded and continued climbing. 10 minutes later, she asked the same question. Dawa moved closer, recognizing the confusion as a symptom of cerebral edema, brain swelling that disrupted cognition and would progress to unconsciousness and death if not reversed by immediate descent. He told Mingma they needed to go down immediately. that waiting longer would make descent impossible. Before Mingma could respond, Deborah sat down in the snow and refused to move. She repeated that she hadn't come this far to quit, that the summit was close, and she was finishing what she started. When Mingma tried to help her stand, she pushed his hands away with surprising force. When Dawa explained they were out of time, she accused him of sabotaging her expedition. The turnaround time had already passed. Dawn was approaching. They were descending whether she cooperated or not. What followed was a struggle with physics rather than will. Deborah had stopped functioning as a climbing partner and become dead weight that needed to be moved down technical terrain in the death zone. At sea level, 2 fit men could carry 240 pounds between them without excessive difficulty. At 28,200 feet, with steep terrain, technical challenges, and their own bodies failing from hypoxia and exhaustion, it was nearly impossible. They clipped her harness into the fixed line between them and tried to inch her down in short, controlled drops. They tried for nearly 2 hours, lowering her down short sections of fixed rope, supporting her weight when the angle allowed, pleading with her to help by moving her legs and maintaining some semblance of coordination. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes responding to commands, sometimes staring blankly at nothing, sometimes asking whether they had summited yet. Each meter of descent demanded coordination that both men were running out of. Mingma's fingers had gone numb inside his gloves an hour earlier, making every rope adjustment clumsy and uncertain. Dawa's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, his own hypoxia building as he burned through reserves trying to keep Deborah clipped and controlled. Twice her weight shifted unexpectedly and nearly pulled all 3 of them off the fixed line. They kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant leaving families without support and a woman's body as evidence of their failure. Between long pauses, traffic on the fixed line, and repeated failed attempts to get her moving, the struggle dragged on through the morning. At approximately 10:15 a.m. on May 19, 2017, Deborah Mitchell lost consciousness completely and stopped breathing. Mingma checked for a pulse at her neck and found nothing. No steady beat, no rhythm that returned when he waited and checked again. Dawa cleared ice from her mask and checked her airway as best he could through frozen straps, then opened her flow fully and held the mask tight, but nothing brought her back. The altitude had killed her exactly as they had warned, her body finally surrendering to a rapid spiral of hypoxia and edema that only worsened with every step above the balcony. They stayed with her body for 20 minutes before accepting what could not be changed. Recovery at this altitude was impossible. Given the terrain and her weight, Mingma radioed base camp at 10:40 a.m., reporting the death and their position, and was told a full report would be required upon return. Deborah would remain where she died, another body on Everest's upper slopes, passed by climbers who would never know her name or story. The descent to Camp 4 stretched into a brutal stop-and-start crawl that ended late that night, leaving both Sherpas frostbitten and emotionally shattered. The official investigation cited high-altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema, noting the client had been warned repeatedly and chose to continue. Initial online reaction blamed the Sherpas, but the narrative shifted as other clients, radio transcripts, and oxygen logs confirmed her refusals to descend. The criticism faded. Mingma continued guiding, but began refusing unqualified clients, even at personal cost. Dawa left expedition work entirely, opening a small tea house in Namche Bazaar. Deborah's body remains at approximately 28,200 feet, slowly absorbed into the ice, a reminder that Everest does not care why someone climbs. It was April 28, 2016. Weather forecasts showed promising patterns for mid-May summit attempts on Mount Everest. Expedition teams were pushing through acclimatization rotations. Claudia Kensington was 48, a pharmaceutical sales director from Boston who managed a large team. She was known for demanding management and refusing excuses. She'd hired an expensive expedition company for premium service. From the beginning, she treated guides and staff as service employees rather than expert advisors. The trek to base camp showed Everest wouldn't respond to her usual approach. She struggled with altitude, arriving with a persistent headache and shortness of breath lasting 3 days. The expedition doctor recommended extra rest. Claudia refused, stating she had business obligations in 6 weeks. She brought a satellite phone and spent hours daily on conference calls from 17,600 feet. During the first acclimatization rotation, Claudia's oxygen saturation levels were consistently lower than others. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, her saturation was 65%, while others registered 70 to 75%. The guide recommended a slower schedule. She dismissed the concern, stating she'd completed the rotation. and felt fine. The second rotation began April 28th. The plan was to climb to Camp 2, spend one night, continue to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet briefly, then descend. Claudia reached Camp 2 with oxygen saturation at 64%. She complained of headache and nausea. The doctor noted her breathing seemed labored, but lungs sounded clear. That evening, Claudia spent 2 hours on a conference call, her raised voice audible to others. She appeared agitated and had difficulty sleeping. The next morning, she reported poor sleep and headache, but insisted she was ready. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 ascends the Lhotse face at 45 degrees or steeper, taking 4 to 6 hours. Claudia struggled from the beginning. Her pace was slow with frequent rest stops. She reached Camp 3 at 2 p.m. after 7 hours, exhausted and breathing heavily. Her oxygen saturation was 58%. The guide noticed her breathing seemed more labored than expected. Claudia admitted feeling extremely tired and short of breath. The guide decided to descend immediately. Claudia protested, saying she needed rest first. After discussion, she agreed. Descent began at 2:30 p.m. Within 15 minutes, Claudia was in serious trouble. Her coordination was poor and she moved extremely slowly. At approximately 23,000 feet, she began coughing. The cough was wet. Pink frothy sputum appeared on her glove. The guide recognized high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. Fluid was accumulating in Claudia's lungs. HAPE requires immediate descent and can progress to death within hours. The guide radioed an emergency call. Over the next hour, Claudia's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her coughing became more frequent with pink frothy fluid. Her breathing became increasingly labored, rapid, shallow breaths. Her lips and fingernails took on a bluish tint. Her oxygen saturation was 48%, critically low. The guide and 2 staff who'd climbed to assist essentially dragged Claudia down the Lhotse face. She could barely move. By 6 p.m., they'd only reached 22,000 feet. Claudia's consciousness was declining. She seemed confused and couldn't follow instructions. At approximately 21,500 feet, Claudia collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing violently, bringing up large amounts of fluid. Then she slumped onto her side. The guide checked her breathing, rapid and gurgling. Her oxygen saturation was unmeasurable. He administered supplemental oxygen at maximum, 4 liters per minute. Her saturation came up to 52%, but she remained semi-conscious and unable to move. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The guide radioed for helicopter evacuation, but helicopters couldn't operate at 21,500 feet as darkness fell. The team continued dragging Claudia. By 7:30 p.m., they reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet. A helicopter attempted to reach them, but couldn't land safely. The pilot radioed he would try at first light. Claudia was placed in a tent with continuous oxygen. The doctor monitored her through the night. Her condition remained critical, semi-conscious, breathing rapidly, coughing up fluid. Her saturation remained in the low 50s despite maximum oxygen. At approximately 3 a.m. on April 30th, Claudia's breathing became more irregular. Several rapid breaths, then stopping for 10 to 15 seconds, then gasping. This pattern indicated her brain was being affected by severe oxygen deprivation. At 3:47 a.m., she stopped breathing entirely. The doctor attempted CPR, but knew it was futile at 21,000 feet. After 15 minutes, he stopped. Claudia Kensington was dead. The helicopter evacuation proceeded at dawn as body recovery. Claudia's body was flown to lower altitude, then returned to Boston. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, with contributing factors of inadequate acclimatization, continued ascent despite symptoms, and delayed descent. It was March 15th, 2017. The route between Camp 1 and Camp 2 stretched across exposed ice slopes at 20,500 feet, where sudden weather changes could trap climbers in whiteout conditions within minutes. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, threatening to engulf the mountain in dangerous conditions. Janet Middlesworth was 45, a retail district manager from Arizona who had spent 20 years supervising employees and enforcing company standards. She believed that proper management and clear expectations could solve any problem, including mountain climbing. Janet had zero mountaineering experience beyond weekend hikes in desert terrain, had never used crampons or an ice axe, and had never been in snow deeper than a few inches. She chose Everest specifically because it was the most challenging goal she could imagine, viewing it as the ultimate management test. The exposed ridges and ice slopes between camps offer no protection from sudden weather changes that can engulf the mountain without warning. Navigation becomes extremely challenging when visibility drops, as familiar landmarks disappear and GPS devices can malfunction in extreme conditions. The narrow routes and steep terrain leave little room for error when weather conditions deteriorate rapidly. Climbers must rely entirely on their guides' experience and local knowledge to navigate safely through these treacherous sections. Janet demanded to see the credentials and certifications of all guides, insisting they provide detailed itineraries with exact timing for each section of the climb. She complained that the guides weren't wearing proper identification badges or uniforms, and requested daily performance evaluations be conducted on all expedition staff. She criticized the guides for not maintaining professional appearance standards and demanded that all safety briefings be provided in writing with her approval. She insisted on reviewing and approving all route decisions before implementation, treating the experienced guides like subordinate employees. When the 23-year-old guide, who had summited Everest 6 times, began leading the descent using GPS and terrain familiarity, Janet fell approximately 20 feet behind the group, refusing to maintain the required close formation. At 3:15 p.m., visibility dropped to 0 as the storm intensified. Janet complained loudly about the guide's competence and demanded to speak with a more senior guide. At 3:45 p.m., she became completely separated from the group when she chose to follow what she believed was a better route. The guide noticed her absence and immediately began search protocols, but the whiteout conditions made visual contact impossible. The storm's intensity made communication impossible as wind howled across the exposed slopes. Janet's voice, calling for help, was immediately swallowed by the roaring wind, and her attempts to use her radio produced only static. The blowing snow stung her exposed face and began accumulating on her goggles, further reducing her already limited visibility. Her expensive GPS device showed conflicting readings due to the extreme weather conditions, leaving her completely disoriented. As hypothermia began setting in, Janet's decision-making became increasingly impaired. She continued to move in what she believed was the correct direction, but her path led further away from safety with each step. The cold penetrated her clothing as she struggled against the wind, and her movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. Ice began forming on her breathing apparatus, making each breath more difficult as the storm raged around her isolated position. Janet continued descending in the wrong direction, moving further from the established route. By 4:30 p.m., she was completely lost and began showing signs of panic and hypothermia. The guide radioed base camp at 4 p.m., reporting a missing climber. Search teams were organized, but the storm conditions prevented immediate deployment. GPS tracking showed Janet's last known position, moving away from the safe descent route. Radio attempts to contact her personal device received no response. The storm continued for 8 hours, preventing any rescue attempts until the following morning. Janet's body was found 400 yards from the established route, approximately 1,000 feet below where she was last seen. The medical examiner determined cause of death was severe hypothermia, with contributing factors of exposure and exhaustion. Evidence showed she had attempted to build a snow shelter, but lacked proper technique. The investigation concluded that failure to follow guide instructions and separation from the group during whiteout conditions led to her death. It was May 19, 2016. Weather conditions on Mount Everest were deteriorating after a brief summit window had closed the previous day. Other teams were still high on the mountain, racing against worsening conditions. Felicity Whitmore was 46 from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she ran an event planning company built on rigid schedules. Before leaving for Nepal, she created a comprehensive spreadsheet detailing every day of the expedition, specific time blocks for each activity, exact dates for each camp, the precise day she would summit. The guide explained that Everest doesn't follow schedules. Weather and conditions dictate timing. Felicity responded that proper planning prevents problems. The expedition deviated from her schedule almost immediately. Weather delays put them 2 days behind. Felicity became visibly stressed. During acclimatization, her inflexibility created constant friction. When the guide recommended extra rest due to high winds, Felicity refused, stating rest was scheduled for the following day. By mid-May, Her schedule had become disconnected from reality. On May 17th, Felicity's team moved to Camp 3. The plan was to move to Camp 4 on May 18th, then attempt the summit that night. At Camp 3, the guide emphasized a turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 19th, regardless of position. Felicity argued that 1 p.m. was too early. The guide stated firmly that clients who didn't agree would not be permitted to attempt the summit. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 18th. Felicity arrived at 3 p.m., exhausted. Oxygen saturation 61%. The guide told her to rest before the summit push at 10 p.m. Felicity spent the rest period checking gear and reviewing her timeline. She barely rested. The summit push began at 10 p.m. Conditions were marginal. Higher winds than forecasted. Temperature minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Felicity climbed aggressively, pushing past other climbers. The guide repeatedly told her to maintain steady pace. Felicity ignored him. By midnight, she was ahead of her group. At 1 a.m., her pace began to slow. They reached the balcony at 27,500 feet around 4 a.m. Behind her calculated pace, she became visibly agitated. The climb to the south summit was brutal. Winds increased to 40 to 50 miles per hour. Wind chill approaching minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet, around 7:30 a.m., she was completely exhausted. She collapsed in the snow, unable to stand. The guide assessed her condition, coherent but extremely fatigued. Oxygen saturation 56%, movement slow and uncoordinated. He decided they would not continue. They would descend. Felicity refused. The guide explained she was exhausted, weather was deteriorating, and they needed to descend. Felicity checked her watch. Only 7:30 a.m. They had until 1 p.m. The guide explained the turnaround time was for being back at this position and descending, not for reaching the summit. The guide stated firmly they were descending. Felicity refused to move. After 10 minutes, the guide told her he was descending with or without her. Felicity stated she was continuing. The guide radioed base camp. They advised him to descend. He made one final attempt. She refused. He began descending around 7:50 a.m. Felicity rested 20 minutes, then climbed toward the summit at extremely slow pace. At 9:30 a.m., she reached the Hillary Step, taking 45 minutes to ascend it. The final 200 feet took another 45 minutes. She reached the summit around 11 a.m., alone. She sat down, too exhausted to stand, and remained 15 minutes before descending. The descent was catastrophic. By the time she descended the Hillary Step around 12:30 p.m., she'd been moving for 13 and a half hours. Her pace slowed to 50 feet every 10 minutes. At 1 p.m., the turnaround time, she was still at 28,600 feet. She sat down, unable to continue. She tried to radio but couldn't operate it. Cognitive function severely impaired. At 1:30 p.m., weather deteriorated sharply. Wind increased to 60+ miles per hour. Visibility dropped. Snow fell. At 2 p.m., climbers found Felicity sitting unresponsive. She was conscious but severely hypothermic and unable to move. They radioed base camp. Base camp told them to do what they could, then descend. The climbers gave her an oxygen bottle at maximum flow and tried setting up shelter, but wind was too strong. After 30 minutes, they descended at 2:45 p.m. No one else passed her position. At some point during the afternoon or evening, Felicity Whitmore died from hypothermia, exhaustion, and hypoxia. Her body was found May 21st, frozen solid, where the climbers had left her. The oxygen bottle was empty. Official cause of death was exposure and hypothermia with contributing factors of exhaustion and hypoxia. The investigation noted she'd summited more than 3 hours after her guide recommended turning back and been caught by forecasted deteriorating weather. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.